So I'm Marc Weber of the Computer History Museum, and I'm here with my colleague David Brock doing the second part of our oral history with networking pioneer Judy Estrin. And today is the 5th of February 2020. And thank you for continuing the story.
Thank you guys for capturing it all.
So we were sort of in the middle of Bridge.
Mm-hmm.
And there were some things you wanted to mention at the start that I think about women at Bridge and a couple of other things.
Yeah, just when I left here before thinking about those times, one is that we actually had a few women, but an unusually high percentage of women in the team in the early days of Bridge. And in the engineering team, Valerie Lasker, who was one of the leaders, Cindy Young, who went on to do at 3Com and do a lot in standards and IPv6 and other things. And so those are two names that jump out at me, in addition to Kate Muther, who came in a little bit later as our head of marketing after we went public, but went on to play a very important role at Cisco. And so she was one of Cisco's first marketing VPs. And so it just, again, it's only a handful of names, but at the time, most companies didn't even have, well, less than a handful of women. And I think that was something that was very important in our culture because of me, but also Bill, in terms of just feeling from the beginning that having the best team implied diversity, and it wasn't trying to hire women. It was about hiring really talented people, and in that, women played a really important role. So,
in your explanation for that,
mm-hmm.
The contrast implicitly is that somehow people in other firms were ignoring or somehow self-preventing from seeing the opportunity in hiring some of the candidates who happen to be women. Could you talk a little bit about why you thought that was? What allowed, sort of a clear vision in your place and maybe a murky vision or a biased vision in other places?
I think, and I think today, I think it is, like so many things, not one or the other. It's a combination of things. And it's a combination of how we self-select, those of us who are doing the interviewing. And unfortunately, pattern recognition plays a big role in how we hire. Sometimes that pattern recognition is implicit in our biases. One of the problems, I think, fast forwarding today, and this is an algorithmic problem in general, we filter people out with algorithms before we filter them out with our instincts, and so that pattern recognition has become accelerated in some cases because it's what do you pattern on, and is it your experience, is it your education, all sorts of things. So some of it is, I think, you're interviewing somebody and how comfortable do you feel? How do you perceive that person? Do you perceive them as strong, too strong? Does that change whether it's a male or a female? I mean, we deal with these issues a lot with our leaders today in terms of who's a strong leader, who is too strong, how do you perceive women versus men? So I think there's that, the way we get beyond that is a combination of things, is recognizing our biases and being very aware that all of us have biases. And some women are more positively inclined towards hiring women. Some women are negatively inclined towards hiring women, and vice versa. So whether it is gender, race, class, any of these things, we need to recognize that we have these biases and figure out how to overcome them. So that's on the interviewer side. On the talent side or the individual side, people gravitate towards environments where they think they will be welcome, where they think they will be recognized, where they will have a chance. And so often if there's a woman executive, when you're competing for great talent, where are they going to go? Where might they feel like they're welcome? Then there's the culture of the organization. And just by interviewing and what questions you're asking, and do you give somebody, what kind of test you give somebody, or if you give them a test versus asking questions, all of those suggest things about the culture of the organization. So I think there's lots of elements. I think that we ended up with a combination of those things, a non-political environment, an openness to try to recruit talent from different people, a welcoming, a level of respect, role models, all of those things combined, I think, help the environment.
So how those particular women then that you mentioned, is there any, how did you recruit them? Is there any story
So
there?
I do remember that, I can't remember how Cindy Young first came to us, but Valerie Lasker was part of a group that had been doing work at AT&T Labs in networking, and they closed down that lab just as we were starting Bridge, and we ended up with a number of people, and you're going to ask me the other names and I can't remember them, of people from that group, and we're very fortunate to hire Valerie at the time. So
then should we just go into the Bridge story in
yeah,
general?
that's fine. I think the other things
Unless there's, because you were saying the others will come up organically.
I think, yeah.
Okay.
I think they will.
So tell us about, this was in about 85, roughly, where we left off.
Right. So I think we left off. I was about. We left off right before we took the company public.
Right.
And I think that that was just. I mean, it was interesting time from a number of different scenarios or cases, which is. We didn't go public into an up market. We went into a market where the market was not frothy or great, but it was the right time for Bridge to go public. I don't think, I may be wrong thinking nostalgically back, but it doesn't feel like we gamed the market as much as companies went public when they were ready to go public from a profitability and a maturity perspective. And part of that is that at the time when you took a technology company public, you talked to analysts who were looking at the fundamentals of the company. That stock decisions weren't made by algorithms, they were made by people. And there was a network of analysts in the various firms who got to know the companies and really were making decisions based on fundamentals that were less volatile in terms of, going public this quarter, this month, that month. And so it was a very different time in terms of the decision to take the company public. We had, and this is less on the technical side of the Valley as the finance side, but when we had done our mezzanine round, that was our first round that we worked with an investment bank. And Carter McClellan and Frank Quattrone had just started a technology office for Morgan Stanley here. We were their first technology deal. They had never taken technology companies public. And we got to know Frank and Carter, and they did our mezzanine financing. So we had a relationship with them. As an aside, I can still remember we became, Bill and I were both good friends with Frank Quattrone and with Carter, but I still remember we were having dinner or something when Bill said to Frank, "You should call up the founders of the leaders of Cisco. That company, when they go public, will be important for you to know." And Morgan Stanley did end up getting their business. So the reason it is important is Morgan Stanley and that office played a very strong role in the helping companies scale in those days in terms of recognizing the technology sector as an important sector in the public market. So they had done our mezzanine financing when it came time to do our IPO. We had a relationship with them, and they were the lead investment bank on our IPO. And it was a fascinating process for me and for us as first-time entrepreneurs, the whole process of taking a company public. I used to describe it as it was a way to burn in the executives, meaning like burning in a product, to see whether they really had what it took to continue to grow the company, because the going around the presentations and how intense that process is while you're still trying to run a company was an incredible experience. And when we talk about NCD, I'll talk about what that experience was like having a 2-year-old, because David was one of the first times I think anybody had taken a 2-year-old on a roadshow. But at Bridge, it was exciting, exhausting, and now when I think back on it, interesting. And the other name I wanted to bring into this is a critical part of building Bridge was Jack Bradley, who was our chief financial officer, obviously very instrumental in taking the company public, who went on to be an executive at 3Com, continued to be part of our other companies. Then he ran Packet Design, so has contributed a lot to the Valley.
And whose idea was it to go public at that point? Morgan Stanley and Frank Quattrone, or you guys, combination?
I think it was, we were profitable, needed money. I think when we raised our mezzanine round, we knew that the next stage was to go public. It wasn't pressured, it wasn't, but the timing felt right for the company. And I think in conversations with Frank Quattrone continues to this day, but was very, very strategic in his thinking and thinking about the long-term benefits of the company and its shareholders, and so was also part of that discussion. But it was driven by where the company was and how we felt. I think the two things were how we felt that not only would it bring in the cash in terms of our position, but we were selling, and that triggered me thinking about this, we were selling to a lot of very large enterprise customers. And Citibank, Schlumberger had OEM relationships with Honeywell and Data General, and we were selling to companies that were I think very happy about the products and happy with our relationship, but also wanted to know that we were going to be around. And so taking the company public was an important step in terms of credibility. And I don't think that there's, other than just, again, the process of going public and pricing the shares and things that today seem more, maybe it's looking at it from the outside than the inside, is that I think that today where there's so much focus on valuations and companies, let me back up. I have a sense when I look at the industry today that going public is not part of the milestones of a company in terms of maturity, because we've gone to a place where you raise so much money as a private company and you grow, you stay private as long as possible. And going public today feels more like a financial milestone. In those days, it was like this is a funny analogy, but it was like being bar mitzvahed or bat mitzvahed. It was like graduating from high school. There was it wasn't just a financial event. And I think the other thing is it was I remember having this conversation with our employees and at NCD when we went public, which was going public was a beginning. It wasn't an end. It was a beginning of a next phase. And the stock price wasn't about what happened when we went public. It was about bringing in investors that you wanted them to make money over the long term. It wasn't as much about day-to-day stock price. The feeling that we had as a company, people didn't watch the stock price on a day-to-day basis. It really was a different relationship with the stock market.
And had the employees, did they have enough stock options to make a difference in their lives? I mean, were you
Yes, but at a different level, because the wasn't that a lot of employees had stock prices, but the valuations of companies in those days and how much money was made from each company was different orders of magnitude than the valuations later on. But the distribution of stock was very different in that the venture guys typically had at least 60%. And then of the 40%, the founding team maybe in the beginning had 10 to 20% of it. And then the employees had 20% and the founders, meaning this notion of the founder or the founding team having 40% of the shares or more than that and dual classes of stock, none of that existed in those days.
I mean, is it, because Jim Clark is sometimes credited for changing the model about how much, taking more away from the investors for the management.
Right, but at which company?
Netscape.
Right, but I'm talking about
Right.
Bridge way earlier. So
No, I know, but
yeah, no, we saw a shift over time.
But I mean, it came in that period. Mid-90s is when it really shifted.
Yeah, and look, some of it also is I think of it from our perspective. We at Bridge we were first-time entrepreneurs, and so we had a smaller percentage than at NCD. We had a larger percentage, but it still was very different from what happened starting with Netscape and beyond. And some of that was because times were changing. Some of it was because Jim Clark was a seasoned entrepreneur and had a track record. So like anything else, it is a negotiation. But it also, like many norms drift. Sometimes they don't, often, especially when they're going in a direction that may be anti-fairness, they drift. And this is one that has definitely drifted. Now, let me correct something I said. The venture guys getting 60, 70%, that's not more fair. But the distribution of power and having too much in any one founder's hand and not changing that over time, I believe is not beneficial to the governance of a company over the long term.
But you did not have anything like Cisco. Famously, the VCs had the right to choose management. You had been more careful with that sort of thing, right? Control.
Our control was based on performing and relationship. We didn't have controlling ownership.
But I mean, you didn't give away the right to choose the management team to the investors.
No, but the investors had controlling interests of the shares.
Sure.
So if they wanted to
Effectively,
replace
yeah.
us, they could replace us.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we did not have the control was. We didn't have pre-written control. It was about performing, and it was about, I was going to say we were lucky, but we also chose investors who we believed would, with us, make the right decisions for the long term.
So can you talk about who the investors were then? I mean, obviously Morgan Stanley, but then...
In terms of going public, so the original investors, I think I may have mentioned, were
think you did
Weiss, Peck and
last
Greer,
time.
Merrill Pickard, and Warburg Pincus. Then when we went, and then we did a mezzanine round, which broadened it out in a whole set of investors that were more private equity types of investors. And then when we went public, it was Morgan Stanley was the lead investment bank, and then DLJ was the second, the co-lead. And at the time, I'm trying to remember if it was before we went public or right after. I think it was after we went public. We made a decision. I had been very involved. I was executive vice president with engineering reporting into me. So Eric Benhamou and Jean-Pierre Bosflug. Eric ran software. Jean-Pierre Bosflug ran hardware. And marketing and sales, Dick Bush running sales. He also had Janik Pathak, who was running marketing. Jack, who was the CFO, reported into Bill, as well as manufacturing, which I'm drawing a blank on who ran manufacturing. But because so many of these customers were interested in the technology, I, from the very beginning, started to visit a lot of the customers and build relationships with the customers. And I think it was probably a year after we went public, I don't remember the exact timing, we decided to make a shift where I, still with my executive vice president title, and I was also on the board with Bill, we had marketing and sales report into me. And at that, I think that was the point at which Eric became VP of engineering, and all of engineering reported into Eric. And so I got more directly involved in the sales and marketing activity from a line responsibility as opposed to from the side at that point. And so at the point at which we decided to merge with 3Com, I was running all of the marketing and sales was reporting into me.
And for even with lower amounts than today, I mean, for you and Bill, this did change your life circumstance when you went public.
Yes. Now, when we went public, we didn't sell any shares, so it clearly changed our life. But the contrast I was making is the orders of magnitude of what people are talking about today. And, at that point, and I feel weird saying this, but a couple $1 million was life-changing. And a couple $1 million is still life-changing in most contexts outside of Silicon Valley and even in Silicon Valley. So I feel silly talking about the numbers this way. But if you look at a lot of people in the Valley today, the escalation of those values means that people are talking about billionaires and hundreds of millions of dollars as life-changing, as opposed to $1 million, $2 million, $6 million, which is a lot of money.
So did you guys move or buy nice cars, or did it change your your own lives?
So it's funny because when we went public, I remember in between going public and being able to actually sell some stock, which was, we had the lockup and then we were very careful. We did move, I think because we felt like we deserved to move, but we moved to a house that was, or maybe we didn't like our house, I don't remember, but we did move, but we kind of did a lateral move. And then I think it was a year later, we ended up moving again because we couldn't quite afford the house we wanted that we were able to a little bit later. So, it clearly took a we all have interesting relationships with money in terms of what money allows us to do and does it change your life. And I think for us, we still spent most of our time working. But I think it gave us the ability to, and a level of freedom. We didn't go travel, we didn't buy a boat, we didn't go buy things people associate with money. But in my case, personally, I grew up in a well-off, not wealthy, but a well-off home with being able to have the resources I needed. So I don't know that I felt the difference. Bill grew up in an environment where he didn't have everything he wanted. So I think for him, it took more pressure off day-to-day life than for me.
But it certainly must have changed the way you felt about being entrepreneurs. I mean, it was clear that this was...
Yeah, I think it was more, it was a feeling of, we built something. It's a validation of, that's why I think, and I realized I said it, I hadn't thought about it this way. It was a feeling of a milestone, a maturation, but not an end, and but a validation that felt good. But it was less material than it was what it symbolized. I think Bill may have bought a new car. I don't remember. He loved cars. So.
But it was clear that business was not just something you were trying out. You guys were committed at this point.
Yeah.
Do you remember the outlines of the story that you were presenting during that roadshow, or the general thrust of the message that you were sending to these potential investors?
The reason I'm hesitating is I'm trying to go back and remember it then versus the earlier rounds. And there's no question that it was a vision of what connectivity was doing for the enterprise. It was very enterprise focused, very much about the opportunity for communications in enterprises, and how there was a small number of companies that did it, but how we were positioned against those companies. But it was about interconnecting diverse computers and terminals in the enterprise market, and the benefits of interconnecting diversity and getting you out of silos and being able to connect. Part of what was going on there is IBM often had the mainframe business, and that was corporate, and divisions had mini computers, whether it was Data General or DEC very often, and how the connectivity of these, being able to interconnect diversity, so whether it was terminals into mini computers that could also go to your mainframes, or interconnecting different types of computers, interconnecting different sites, interconnecting different types of networks. It was all about interconnecting diversity.
And was the idea was that essentially something from the enterprise's perspective? Was that about achieving efficiencies, whether of different kinds, or was it the possibility of interconnecting diversity more about kind of letting you do new things once you had this?
You know, I think initially at that time, a lot of it was about they had the diversity. It wasn't about enabling them to do it. It was about their environments having all of this, these different types of equipment. And it wasn't even that it was, many of these enterprises at the time, and I'll come back to this, but let me put a pin in when Unix was coming into these enterprises in a conversation I had at FedEx. But many of these enterprises, it was almost like they were siloed or had found themselves with different groups making different decisions. So again, corporate was often IBM or, in some cases, Honeywell or one of the other mainframes. The divisions often were buying mini computers. But then the manufacturing group may have made a different decision on what they were buying because of the because the technology for them was better. And then often the enterprises would find, okay, well, I now want the person with the terminal on their desks to be able to get to their departmental mini computer, but they still need to get to the corporate, or they still need to get to the manufacturing floor. So I think as the and this has continued to happen, but as computing evolved to one group in the organization making that, because computers were so big that only corporate IT could make them, or only justified by manufacturing for this particular decision. And actually, there are two trends. One is you're coming down in price, and computing is going to be used in a larger segment of the organization, and you already have your legacy systems, and then you buy a new system, and then how do you interconnect? And the other thing that's happening is a more general purpose nature. So in the manufacturing floor, you may have a vendor that got in because they made a certain type of machine that you needed in manufacturing, and that company then started to have a more general purpose computer that you could use for something else. So these trends, as they happened as the enterprise was evolving, as cost of computing is coming down, then the enterprise doesn't want to or can't throw out what they have. So they're marching forward, buying each new generation, which introduces new vendors, which introduces diversity. Now, some stuck to Big Blue and tried to continue. We used to talk about IT people who wore blue underwear because they wouldn't buy anything that wasn't IBM. But for a lot of these organizations that were more innovative, and you saw this absolutely in academia, where a university might have IT for their human resources, but the research is going on in all of these different systems. So we weren't pushing diversity. We were going in and saying, we can make it more effective because you can communicate between what you have. And that only continued to go as you went from mainframe to mini computers to workstations to PCs to LANs and servers. And so it was a question of interconnecting that.
Okay. You could dig them out of the hole that dug themselves into.
Right. And before our products came out, there were people selling data switches, or Rome would sell switches. But those data switches, typically, if you wanted to not just connect terminals to like systems, but wanted some interconnectivity of different types of terminals or file transfer between machines, this was a better way to do it.
Thank you.
And who did you see as your main competitors at that point?
When we were going, at that time, so our main competitor was Unger and Bass, and Exelan was in the market selling boards. DEC was a competitor in DEC environments because they had their LAT terminal servers. That was LAT was their protocol, local access something. So they had terminal servers for connecting to DEC machines. And so if we were coming into an enterprise through a group that mainly had DEC machines, we competed with DEC. If you came into an enterprise that there was a group trying to buy the same product across different constituents, then it was easier because we were multi-vendor and they were single vendor. But DEC was a competitor.
But their product only was DEC to DEC, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
But in their shops, right?
Right. And then they would claim, well, our terminal server can go to a different system, but not as well. So.
And Wellfleet was in there, and they were not really
They weren't really a bridge competitor. Wellfleet came in. There was a whole set of, there was then a set of people that came in around Ethernet over Twisted Pair. And as things went into a wiring closet type of sale, when we went public, that was not the case. And Cisco wasn't existent when we went public. So.
So then you went public, but you were acquired fairly short time after. I guess 2 years is still a long time in those days. But tell sort of what the arc is.
So we went public. We also, I think it was after we went public and before we merged or were acquired by 3Com, we did a couple of small acquisitions. We acquired a small team in Texas that did RF technology because broadband was, we wanted to have both broadband and baseband. We acquired a small company that was run by Joe Kennedy that was doing secure. Back then, security and communications was it was mainly to sell to the government. So we had done a couple of small acquisitions. We were doing well. We felt we had just started to start thinking about internally how we handled the growing PC market. So as we're selling, and as I said in this evolution, PCs are starting to become more of an issue. We were very close with 3Com. We had an OEM relationship at one point. Because I knew Metcalfe and Ron, and so we were friendly with 3Com. Our salespeople would go together into customers sometimes. 3Com very much was not an enterprise company. It sold through reps and distributors. But I think, and we had it was a natural evolution for us to say, okay, we connect all these devices, now where does the PC fit? But the PC wasn't the dominant connection for us. We still were very driven by connecting terminals to computers, but the PC was growing in terms of its presence. And we thought about doing, and we actually, I don't know, I can't remember now if we shipped it. We did an intelligent PC board that was a high end of what 3Com was doing that had all the protocols on it, and therefore was a higher performance version, but also more expensive. And we were just trying to figure out what the right strategy was. And Bill and I started talking, I don't know if this came for us. I think actually we got a call from Ray Norda, who was running Novell and who had been on our board, wanting to talk about were we interested in merging with Novell. And we had a whole series of conversations with Ray, and we got intrigued by the idea of that it just would make so much more sense than trying to build our own position in the PC market. So the transition there was that we knew the market was transitioning. We wanted to get in ahead of it in terms of the PC market. Those conversations ended primarily because Ray was about to go do something, raise some money. And so we just decided the timing was not right. It didn't end, we didn't say the combination wasn't right, but they were going to go raise money. It wasn't like we needed to merge, and so those conversations ended. But it had put the idea in our head about, well, does this make sense? And I don't remember how the first conversation happened, but we then had a conversation with Metcalfe and Bill Krause and entered into a discussion about what was going to be a merger of equals, even though we were the smaller company, with 3Com. And that ultimately led to the acquisition. And the idea when we went into it was that Bridge would become a division of 3Com, that I would run the Bridge division. Bill Carrico would become president of the whole company, and Bill Krause would be CEO with Bill Carrico as president. But that Krause actually wanted to exit. And so the idea was that over a period of time, not short term, but that Krause would pull back to chairman and Bill Carrico would run the combined thing. Let me preface this by, I'm about to get into a description that was a really, really complicated time having to do with putting companies together, with personalities. And this is one of those cases, and you guys as interviewers, everybody has their own story. And I recognize that, and all I can do is tell you my version of the story as I perceived it going through this. But I just want to acknowledge that we all see these things going through it. It was a combination that was one of those things that brilliant on paper, brilliant strategically, ended up working out well for a lot of people, but was probably, I won't say, it was a terrible year. It was just really hard. So,
but before we jump into that, so tell me the timing though. With Novell, you were having these talks. How long before? I mean, this is '86, or I mean, a while before 3Com, or right before.
It was. I don't remember the exact timing, but there wasn't that long a period of time between ending the talks with Novell, and it certainly was within 6 months that we began these conversations, because often what happens is that when we as an executive team, and it was really the talks with Novell didn't get far enough that people in the company knew it, but it's the small group of us, which was probably myself and Bill and Jack, and I think probably Eric and Jean-Pierre. I'm trying to remember exactly. Yeah, they were involved in this. That when you start as an executive team, you start looking at an issue and imagining what might happen. If you're a good executive team, it opens your mind also to realize, well, maybe there's this benefit, or maybe there's this disadvantage. So when you're going down a path and you have these conversations and they end, sometimes they end because you decide it's the wrong thing to do. Sometimes they end because it's timing. And then all of a sudden you may decide, oh God, that was not a good idea. I dodged a bullet. I'm glad I didn't continue down that path. Or you can end up in a situation of, in thinking about this and trying to wrap my head around what it means to actually merge with a bigger company, looking at the PC market, looking at our market, where is it going? you may then, as we did, said, you know what, given the trends and what's going on, this makes a lot of sense. And so what do we want to do about it? And how do you handle that? And it makes you more open. So that was more, and I think what I'm trying to stress also is Bridge was not in distress. Bridge had a very healthy business. But as is, I think, true a pattern with Bill's and my companies, is we tended to be ahead of the trends. We tended to be pioneers, which doesn't always mean you get to be the biggest company, but we tended to be early to market in terms of technology trends. And we saw the early detections of what was coming and how these markets were going to change, and realized that the importance of a PC strategy was critical to that.
And where did workstations fit in? I mean, you had good contacts with Sun early on, which you mentioned, but I mean, were you selling to workstation makers?
We were selling to, we were selling alongside workstation companies. We were selling to workstation companies. A lot of the Unix vendors used our products in their own development shops. We weren't, many of the, at that time, the workstation companies were not positioning themselves as server companies. So they were still trying to push the notion of, you want this on your desk. And they later evolved into, yes, they wanted to send you they wanted to sell you a Sun workstation, but they realized the benefit of the server business. But and one of the things that is, and I think about our various companies and think about that time, and anybody who looks at the arc of the computer business since that time, is that there's a number of intersecting trends and zigzags that we've gone through. And so one of them is the client-server zigzag, which is time sharing. Everything's here. No, we need to distribute it. Now there needs to be processing on the desk. No, it needs to be some processing on the desk, which is what X Windows was about. And boom, we're back in the cloud. And that whole client-server evolution that Bridge came in at one point. NCD was the, we'll get to this, was the X window, which is a predecessor to cloud. And then Precept was video over IP, but took advantage again of more processing on the desktop. So you can see that trend. But the other trend that overlaps with that is the vertical integration versus open systems, and whether or not companies tended to be vertically integrated, which an IBM strategy or a closed system DEC strategy with VMS, versus adopting an open systems strategy, which Unix was. And then there are these in-betweens where you have Microsoft, which is open, but it's open with an API. You're still driven by their systems. And a company like Sun that embraced Unix, but in a Spark Solaris way, and then Linux came in and undermined them. So there's these interesting trends between various levels of vertical integration and horizontal innovation. And I don't think I mentioned this last time, but I have a slide from 2011, and we'll come back to this, but I was giving a presentation on lessons learned as I looked at the industry in different times. And we started out with vertical integration. There was video, there was data processing, there was telephony, AT&T, IBM, different vertical integration. We went through this, and my career is represented by this really rich innovation around open systems, not open source, but open systems, which was horizontal openness and compatibility between different types of systems and operating systems. And it was about IP, it was about Linux, it was about the initial web. And the slide I have then was in 2011, had a third piece which said mobile, social, cloud, because that's where we were. We were about those technologies that came in. It had a big question mark. And it said, are we going to go back to vertical integration, or are we going to embrace what we've learned in these years about open systems? And we went back, because at that time there were people thinking about standards for cloud computing, and we hadn't gotten locked into where we are today. And the part that makes me sad is that vertical integration, the value, as you grow, the value accrues to the integrator. When you have horizontal and more open innovation, the value is spread more evenly. And so we ended up going back and forth. And I say this now because just to put in perspective where Bridge was, and as the PC came in, was one of those shifts to the desktop. But it also, Unix in those days was not, it was open, but not quite the Linux that we think about today. I think it was more open in the academic environment than the Unix implementations that were sold to enterprises.
But people were starting to integrate workstations into different work environments, particularly.
Yes.
So, I mean, did that also provide, like you were talking about the card you had for PCs that was more expensive, I guess.
Yeah, that provided.
But I mean, in the workstation market, you could do those more sophisticated
Yes,
things.
and in the workstation environment provided us an opportunity, because you'd buy an expensive workstation, whether it was Silicon Graphics or Sun, and we'd go in there and say, I know your designer needs this workstation, but what about the admin? What about these other people? What about what about dialing in from home? So we were able to bring terminal or character connectivity into these highly graphics environments.
Apollo as well, or is that?
Yes, Apollo as well. Apollo a little bit less, because they were not as initially as focused around Ethernet. But Apollo also, yes.
But PCs was clearly so large and
well, when we
different
did this,
price
PCs
point.
were starting to be embraced by the enterprise. And the strategy was, if you could go into an enterprise and be able to provide connectivity of this next generation of desktop and computing, and the terminals and the computers, you could become the communications vendor for these enterprises. What I just said, though, was the crux of the problem with that merger. Because in the end, and we can take a step back and get how we got here, but when I look back, Bill Krause wanted it to be a computer company. He wanted to focus on replacing HP. He had an HP background. So his vision was that PCs and servers would replace the mini computer, that view of client-server computing, that he wanted to be the vendor that sold those types of systems. He thought in terms of 3Com being the future of systems. We thought of the combined 3Com as being a stronger communications company, and of which PCs were one of the things to be connected. And that fundamental difference in where we saw, there was a lot of other cultural issues, but what we thought the strategic view for the outcome of the company should be was the fundamental problem between, at a management level, of putting those together. Now, ironically, when Eric went to the board and presented the Renaissance plan when he became CEO, that Renaissance plan was the communication strategy that we had when we wanted to put these two companies together. But when Bill and I exited, it was in some ways saying, you're the bigger company, we don't want to have a board fight, you're going to go in this direction and there's nothing we can do about it. Eric then had the patience and the perseverance and came back around and reoriented the company back to a communications company.
Which, I mean, 3Com had started as a communications company.
Right.
So it was essentially Krause was trying to take it in a different direction at that point.
Well, except you can say a different. They had started that way with a board when Krause had been at the company for a couple of years, and they had the 3-server, and their view was that a PC network, you can't separate out communications from the computing. And in some ways, it's like the network is the computer is the network. It's a question on what you focus on. We felt that the strategy there were two pieces of it. One is where you put your emphasis, and that there was too much emphasis going on the server and the applications and building up all the things you need. It wasn't so much a technological difference as an emphasis of where your resources went to and how you sold it. And if you're selling something that is mainly work group focused, that's a very different focus than when you're trying to go into an enterprise and provide a broad range of solutions, of which a work group is part of it, but where your resources. The other big difference is 3Com had almost no direct touch with their customers, and the work group sale was through distribution. 3Com's culture was extremely direct touch and enterprise sale oriented. Now, could we have put those companies together and gotten the best of both? I think so. But not with the combination of personalities we had. It didn't seem like it was going to work.
And is there some potential tension? I mean, if a company's making computers and also, I mean, Bridge was selling just connectivity and had no horse in the race as to which computer to use. If you're also selling computers and more integrated systems, there's a potential conflict.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. I mean, there's all sorts of nuances to that. And we had effectively an office of the president. And those are really, really difficult when you get along. And we tried. We had a series of strategy meetings, and there was a certain amount of difficulty just integrating the cultures. Now, Eric went and ran the 3+ group. So one of the things that happened as part of the merger is he moved over to be general manager of the server software. I was running the Bridge division, which was the Bridge business, and Bill Carrico was trying to rationalize all of this. And we had a bunch of strategy meetings, saying, what does this company... We had a wonderful honeymoon period where we all either kidded ourselves that we were using the same phrasing, or we were being nice to each other, or who knows what happened. We went on a wonderful road show, and it sounded unbelievably strategically great. Made a lot of money for, I think, everybody's investors benefited. And then you come back and you're doing the work of integrating and trying to come up with allocating resources between your different divisions, and you start getting into a strategy of what's more important and where are you going and what does this company look like. And we'd get in a room, and the personalities were like those finger puzzles, those finger things, you put your fingers in it, and as you pull, it like grabs it more.
Yes.
And as you pull, it like grabs it more. And as you pull, it like grabs it more. And as you pull, it like grabs it more. And as you pull, it like grabs it more. And as you pull, it like grabs it more. And as you pull, it like grabs it more. And as you pull, it like grabs it more. And as you pull, it like grabs it more. And as you pull, it like grabs it more. And as you pull, it like grabs it more. And as you pull, it like grabs it more. And as you pull, it like grabs it more. And as you pull, it like grabs it more. And as you pull, it like grabs it more. And as you pull, it like grabs it more. And as you pull, it like grabs it more. And as you pull, it like grabs it more. And as you pull, it like grabs it more. And as you pull, it like grabs it more. And as you pull, it like grabs it more. And as you pull, it like grabs it more. And as you pull, it like grabs it more. And as you pull, it like grabs it more. And as you pull, it like grabs it more. And as you pull, it like grabs it more. And that's kind of like what some of those personalities, a lot of passion. And it got to a point where it just didn't, and some of it came from Bill and Bill, and that thing of who's in charge and personalities, and both of them are very strong, and I would say both of them have difficult personalities, and so there was that. You have Bob Metcalfe,
I was going to ask one.
who is brilliant and at the time, and also has a very strong personality, but at the time was playing this interesting role. He wasn't actually running a piece of the company, but it was his baby, and he couldn't stand what was going on, and he couldn't stand the thought that it might happen, and so he would get very upset and would walk out of a meeting, and he will probably tell you that Bill Carrico was difficult. And now, I, of course, am sitting here thinking, okay, I tried. I probably was difficult some of the time, too, but I have more of a facilitating personality as opposed to a yelling, walk out of the room personality. But these were just, looking back, I can smile, but they were awful. They were awful. And I think that, I remember Krause and Carrico had marriage counseling at one point, meaning brought in an organizational development person in terms of how would this work. And Bill and I just decided that this wasn't good for the company.
But let's, before we
Right.
move on, so I mean, how long was the honeymoon before, and how long was it, and when did you realize it was over? The honeymoon.
Well, we left about 9 months after we merged. And so if we're going to use the marriage metaphor, there's a honeymoon, and then there's a time when there is no such thing as a honeymoon, and you have problems. And so there was a period of time of, okay, this is a problem, work through it. To be honest, I think that I sensed problems from one perspective earlier than Bill, in that I was running Bridge, and I couldn't get the attention that we needed for Bridge. It was kind of like we were suddenly not a merger of equals. And for Bill Carrico, who had to go out of the way to make the whole company feel like he was thinking about the whole company, and Eric had gone over to run part of the 3Com. So here I am with the Bridge division, kind of as I can remember having conversations with Bill Carrico and saying, don't forget about where we came from. What about us? Now, again, partly because of my relationship with Bill Carrico and the way I tend to operate, I would then try to I would look at it from a company perspective as well as a division perspective, but I got really torn during those times because I needed to keep Bridge going and everybody feeling good about themselves at a time when there was a lot of discussion about resources, and my sales guys were just really upset because 3Com only knew how to deal with distributors, and so there was a lot of those are just the I'm not making light of them, but mergers are hard. And when you don't have, they're hard enough when you have a clear big company acquiring a small company. And I realize now I've been acquired, I've done the acquisition, I've been on boards I've been involved in so many of these combinations. They're hard. And but when you have ambiguity about the strategy or the size or who's making the decision,
Who's in charge, yeah.
and are not don't put enough effort into the people issues. I mean, one thing that Cisco just really thought about those integration issues. From being on the board of Disney, the way Disney has done some of the major acquisitions they've done over the last 10 years with just such a consideration for culture and the strategy, and how do you make sure not to ruin the company that you are acquiring. Those are great examples. But there are many more examples of companies that are either destroyed or go backwards as part of that integration. I remember at Cisco, I used to tell people that when you acquire a company, assume they're going to lose 20% of their productivity for a year. Unless you add resources, that's what it takes to integrate cultures, to integrate business lines. So when we merged, there was a certain amount of what was going on, which was just the natural integration of strategies that you work through, and you hope to emerge. There's a reason you did that merger and merge stronger. What happened here is because we were having these problems at the top, and very soon after we closed the acquisition, Bill Krause didn't want to pull back. He wanted to stay involved, and so it became a much more, now, for whatever reason, it could have been because he was concerned about the strategy, could have been that he changed his mind, I'm not, but having two people at the top with really different styles and strong personalities, so when you're making decisions about salaries and how you give raises and what titles the person who ran Bridges software group is a wonderful person, Terry Gray, who you probably know. He then went to the University of Washington. He had been at UCLA. And just one of these people-oriented, deep technologists, wonderful, wonderful people. And when we ended up part of 3Com, and he was being told kind of what titles he could have and couldn't have, with a level of kind of disrespect for his engineers, I just could feel his frustration because you were trying to take one culture and put it on another. And I think they were a little bit more homogeneous, cookie cutter in their approach to HR. You did it this way. We were a little bit more about respecting people and wanting cohesion and wanting fairness, but you didn't have to have everybody fit in a certain box. And those types of things just started to clash. The Krause-Carrico thing. Then we got into this strategic conversation, and it became, it was, after 6, 7, 8 months, we were just concerned that either we needed to try to go to the board to force something or leave. And Bill and I talked about it a lot and decided that our responsibility was to the shareholders and the employees over the long term, and that we thought a board fight was just not even, whether we could win or not, we never even went and talked to the board members about it, because we just didn't think it was fair to the company.
And when there was real intense conflict between Bill and Bill, so what role did Bob Metcalfe play, if any? I mean, how did he react? You said it upset him, but.
I think there were two types of conflict, again, with Bill and Bill, and one of them was running the company and this, how we were running the company. And I don't know that, I can't remember, other than Metcalfe didn't like Bill Carrico, doesn't to this day, and would probably blame a lot of this on Bill Carrico. And so I do remember having one conversation with Bob Metcalfe about Bill Krause's style and the positive aspects of his style, but also acknowledging that Krause is relentless in what he wants. Again, sometimes our strengths can
style.
also be, and I don't know that I can. I think it's, again, strong, relentless, but Bill Krause came from a environment where he also, and I think this is, again, the difference in the culture, a very structured view, and the HR department, and you put in very much about, you put in processes and scale those processes. An enterprise business, and maybe also our leadership style, allowed for more nuance in the decisions. And I never worked for Bill Krause, so I can't really tell you what his style was to work for. Other than he wasn't really very respectful of me, and
In what way?
well, so when we, and I have met him since then. Again, we're friendly. This is not about as people, but as leaders in terms of, we were talking about women and how you handle women. So when we decided to leave, there was this whole discussion of the press release and what the press release would say. And the press release was drafted. It wasn't my role to draft it. The press release was drafted that Bill Carrico and his wife were leaving. And I basically said, yeah, I am his wife, but in this context, I am general manager of the Bridge division. I am not.
Well, co-founder of Bridge.
And co-founder of Bridge. And he simply would not change the press release. We're going back and forth. This is over the course of a day. And I ended up having a meeting with him, Kate Muther, I think. And there was one other woman in the room. And he, again, Bill Krause is relentless. He can be really stubborn, probably a strength, but can be really hard when you're trying to get him to listen. And he wouldn't change his mind until I looked at him and said, because I'm like, I don't know what to say anymore. And I said to him, Bill, people know me. I am known in the industry. People know that I am a co-founder of this company and part of it. You're going to look sexist. And he changed his mind. So there is that. And again, I don't think he meant to hurt me. I think he saw this as Bill didn't really think about it, didn't think it was important. And we tried all sorts of things. It didn't get through. And then that perception was like, oh my God. But to me, that is form over function. And again, he had lots of women working for him who were great women and strong women and would probably argue, this is an example of not overt sexism, but that implicit positioning. And I know why he wanted to keep the press release that way. Why did he want to keep the press release that way? Because it didn't look like two executives left the company. He didn't want to look like a mass exodus.
Minimize the damage.
If I'm Bill's wife, then if Bill is leaving, I'm leaving because Bill's leaving, not because I think there's a problem. And he was thinking he needed to do whatever he could do to minimize the impact of this press release. But sometimes we need to weigh both. And we need to weigh the press release in the long term and the short term and the sign it sends to other people. And then also sometimes you're with a person and you respect that person. So all of these things come into play. So again, I can look at it and understand, but it stuck with me.
Now, you had, at Bridge, you had acquired, you said, a couple of companies, which, by the way, I don't know if you gave the name of those, but I mean, that I assume was that was a positive experience, which is part
Absolutely.
of what led you to want to be acquired.
Yes, but and I will say the companies we acquired, and I can't remember the company in Texas, was a small team. It was a small company that had been building RF modems, and we wanted their, it was wonderful. It was a wonderful team.
How many people roughly?
I'll get this wrong, but something like 10, 15. It wasn't big. And I think also we went out of our way to respect them, respect what they brought, needed to get some synergies and do some integration in terms of HR systems, but were respectful of the fact that they had built a company in it. Whether it was smaller or not, it still was worthy of recognizing that their success came from what they had built. And to go in and assume that you can just change that all is not, in my opinion, the right way to do it.
And the other one?
The other one was Joe Kennedy's company that they were working on, and again, I can't remember the name. There were only about 6 or 7 people there. So they were just starting. Joe and I like to joke about that because he had been my boss when I came to Zilog, and so I got to then acquire his company, and so we.
And at the time that Bridge merged with 3Com, what were the relative sizes, both employees and money?
They were in the whole. We were like 1/3 to 2/3 in terms of the people revenue, the relative sizes.
And how many employees? Either.
I think we had about 450.
Brought you up to 1,300 total.
Mm-hmm.
And do you remember your revenue at the time?
I don't. I want to say it was the number that's coming to my mind is something like 70 million or something. But this is easily looked upable.
Easy. Yeah,
but that's not a word.
But I mean, it was.
We could Google it, but not back in those days. So I have the combined the roadshow we did with 3Com and Bridge, so I probably could.
Okay, but yeah, you had no negative experience around acquisitions before that. There was no reason to.
No, yeah. I think, it's not like we went in thinking it was going to be easy in terms of working through the differences, but I also had never, let me back up. I did have the experience I had, but I'm not sure at the time I really thought about it in the same way, was my experiences at Zilog with Exxon Office Systems and the challenges between different cultures and different incentive structures of different groups. So I did recognize that when you had different cultures and you were trying to reconcile those cultures, again, because Zilog had the development systems and the semiconductors, so I wasn't going in completely naive about cultural and people issues. But I, unlike Bill, who at least had worked in a company with multiple divisions and had been management in those companies, it was before I had done any board work. The only other company I had worked at besides before starting Bridge was really Zilog. It's small except for my small stint at UB. And so I really didn't, I don't think that I...
By the way, I'll add for the transcript, UB, Ungerman
Bass, sorry.
Yeah.
The reason I'm hesitating is I'm trying to see if I remember having any hesitation going into it. I think for me, the main hesitation was, for me, Bridge was like a family and like a child, and that notion no longer having that same relationship because you're part of a whole. But I think we felt better knowing that we ultimately were supposed to be running the company, the whole company. Again, Krause was going to back off or pull back, and that didn't happen. And that may have been where there was some just naivete in terms of not asking enough questions, not talking enough about the strategy ahead of time. But yeah.
And sort of like what David asked earlier about what were you saying on the roadshow of your IPO, what were you thinking or telling people once you and 3Com merged? So how were you going to conquer this PC market, PCs integrated into complex environments? What was the best scenario?
I think, again, it was about this notion of this is the next phase in computing, and networking is a critical part, and being able to connect everything from PCs, work groups, through to mainframes was this, grand strategy.
But what sort of products would you be selling? What would you be selling? A new kind of PC card through their distributor network? I mean, what do you remember?
It was everything. It was, we were gonna, the notion was we had two strong businesses, and this is the classic story, and together they will be even stronger, and that we will continue to and we'll get the synergies of this great distribution system that 3Com had that will continue to strengthen. They already were selling 3 servers and PCs, but it was a question of how much did you enhance that business, and that we were going to continue to focus on interconnectivity. And I think that there was an element of that as PCs became stronger and stronger, that Bridge at that point could focus more and more on inner networking, that you continue to connect the legacy terminals. But if you go back to remember when we first started Bridge, it was going to be about connecting networks. And then there weren't enough networks to connect or interconnect, so you connect terminals to network. Well, fast forward, now there are many more networks. And so the emphasis on the Bridge business could very much be about the bridges and the routers, and yes, the communication servers for modem dial-in and all of that. But it became less about terminals, even though you connected a lot of the terminals, because the world was going towards desktop computing, whether it was workstations or PCs.
But by going into the router market, you would be, almost taking the role that Cisco did.
No, we already were in the router market.
I know.
We were in the router market before Cisco existed.
No, I know that.
Yes, if we had continued, then absolutely. But what happened was that in this distribution, not just where you put resources in terms of developing product, so not enough emphasis on what needed to be done in that routing market, but how you sell those routers. 3Com de-emphasized that business just at a point where it was ready to become a dominant business. Sandy Lerner called me up about 6 months after, 3 months, 4 months, somewhere in that time after we left 3Com. I had never met Sandy, and she asked if she could come visit me. And why did she want to visit me? She wanted to thank me. She wanted to thank me for merging Bridge with 3Com, because all of those enterprise customers that were not getting enough attention from 3Com started to go to Cisco. And that's where Cisco got its initial, not that it wouldn't have done anything or wasn't doing great things, they had a product, but they were having trouble breaking out of a very specific niche that they had been at Stanford. And she literally wanted to thank me for them getting a first part of momentum. And then a bunch of people from Bridge, Kate Muther, Doug Sue, who was one of our great product managers, went and became part of the next phase of Cisco's growth. And when I was CTO at Cisco, Bill Krause came to visit me. I don't remember the purpose of the meeting. Something was going on that, and again, he and I have intersected over the years. And he came into my office and in my conference room, because Cisco has these for the top layer of executives, an office, and you have a conference room, a small conference room right next to it. And I still remember him looking around and said, not many people who can say they were responsible for another company's $450 billion market cap. Cisco had just reached this, one of their peaks of their market cap. And it was, I was glad to hear him register that there was a business there that 3Com could have been in earlier. Now again, Eric, when he became CEO, kind of reestablished the communications part of it. But in that couple of years, their positioning was different. And then, he fought a valiant fight, but it ended up being very different.
So the original idea was that through Bridge, 3Com would continue the direct enterprise and more direct sales into enterprise as well. But that they effectively did not do.
Right, and I think even if you think about 3Com's evolution even in the communication strategy, if there's multiple ways as a company strategy to decide where you're going to focus. What you really want to do is a combination of these, but some companies are heavily technology product focused. They know they have a technological benefit or a product benefit. And then you say, okay, this is my edge. What is the best way to get those products to market? Some companies end up with a distribution channel, and as they expand their product line, they expand it in ways that need to be able to go through that distribution channel. Some companies can do both. So here you put together a company where our distribution channel was a product of who we were selling it to, but also the complexity of the type of the sale. Their distribution channels were a product of the types, the PC market. And their products matched their distribution. You needed to not get more complicated than the distribution channels could sell. So when you are expanding and deciding how to merge, if your main thrust is through that distribution channel, the type of router, the type of bridge, even if you're in the internetworking market, you're going to gravitate towards the volume, lower cost, lower complexity cell. And people standing back would say, of course you do that. That's the larger scale market. And it's true, but Juniper did fine. So it's a where you mess up, you can pick a lot of strategies. Where you mess up is when you don't have a coherent one between your vision, what you're providing, the distribution channels that you sell it through, and that's where we just, the combination of the two and trying to reconcile that. Now, ultimately, it was more the 3Com strategy than the bridge strategy.
Did Sandy Lerner actually come and visit you at that point when she called?
Yeah, no, she did. It was.
And you were still no, you had just left.
We had left, and I can see myself sitting. We had already started NCD because we thought we were going to take time off, and we didn't. So we jumped right into
So you want to talk about, so you and Bill left 3Com.
So we
What
left,
did you do next?
and we were going to take some time off and decide what we wanted to do next. And we got a call. It was one of those things, my roommate at Zilog knew somebody, suggested they give us a call, from a team of people which consisted of Ed Bassert, Martin Eberhardt, Kevin Martin, Mike Harrigan, Doug Klein, and they had been working for about a year. Martin Eberhardt had been at Wise, had the terminal expertise. Ed and Doug and Mike came from Ridge, the system expertise. And they were leveraging this new technology called X Windows. And X Windows was in that pendulum swinging of where do you put the processing power, in that instead of having to have a full workstation on your desk, you could get, what workstations did was get people to realize the benefit of a graphics interface rather than a terminal. And so, but instead of having all the processing on your desk, you could have split the processing in a different way. And so you could have a cheaper desktop device, more like a terminal, if you did the graphics processing on the device. And what X Windows, the standard was about a protocol that ran over internet protocols and over LAN protocols, which allowed you to tell the terminal to draw graphics, as opposed to here's a character and all you could do on the terminal was put up A, B, C, or crude graphics. It was a language for explaining to the desktop how to render graphics without having to have the processing on the desktop. So it was part of this evolution and this, I think, constant trend we have about the cost of processing, storage, bandwidth. And if you think about those three things over time, we over periods of time got better in one and then the other became a bottleneck. And now it's like we have no constraints anywhere. And although when it comes to AI processing, we're back again with needing big compute processing to have an edge with AI, meaning there's an economies of scale and a moat today with AI that you need a minimum level of processing that you can't do on the desktop. So every time we move one of these barriers, we're very clever and we figure out how to take advantage of applications in a new way, and that often creates bottlenecks other places. So we go through this cycle. So we had the bandwidth, but in many cases, and we were trying to not have the cost of the desktop be as high, but still get the graphics. So that's what X Windows was about.
And sorry, were you involved with the X Consortium?
No,
Okay.
not at the time. We as a company ended up, NCD was very involved in the X Consortium, but this was a group of people that had decided that they would build an X terminal. I think the X Consortium at the time was mostly helping lower end workstations run X to connect to higher end workstations, meaning people hadn't built an X terminal. X Windows came out of the Unix community, again, with diverse systems and different levels of performance, and they came up with the protocol. Martin and crew, all of them, had this idea of we can build a really nice-looking terminal that is optimized for running the X Windows systems. And then you don't have to buy a workstation to do this, and actually, by optimizing the design of the hardware for X, we can have better graphics processing at a lower rate. So one of the other trends, we were talking about different things that go back and forth, is do you use generalized computing for everything, or do you use specialized devices? And this was a case where here was a specialized device. And depending on what's going on in the industry, again, in terms of costs, in terms of capabilities, we tend to go back and forth. The first mobile phone was an appliance, it's what I call an appliance computer. And then we turned our phone into a general purpose computer. With the general purpose becomes more complexity, but you can do more things, and then it costs more. And then, so we zip back and forth, depending on Internet of Things is more appliance. So we've gone through these cycles at different times. So NCD was right in that place of how do you evolve the Unix marketplaces where it started. And in some ways, it made workstations more competitive with other types of systems, because you could amortize the cost of a workstation amongst many desktops when you had this beautiful graphics display. So the Sun user didn't have to give anything up, but you got to put that capability on a desktop that couldn't afford their own workstation.
Was there any local disk storage, or it's network storage?
No
So just
disk
thin
storage.
client would be inaccurate.
That's what it was called.
But wasn't 3Com doing something similar in that period, no?
No. They
Was
were
that late?
they
they
were
were pushing.
no. They were doing PCs and servers.
I thought
But
they
you
were
ran-
pushing their own thin client. Okay, I'm wrong.
No,
Sorry.
but you ran the application on the PC, and it was only Windows applications. It wasn't Unix. So it wasn't, thin client actually came out of this time. In some ways, people think about this as an early predecessor to cloud, because we were allowing, we used to say, Sun had this phrase, the network is the computer, and one of our commercials is the network really is the computer in terms of what networking computing was about. There were a few other Tektronix went into the business. There was a company called Graphon was in the business, but the main competition was from workstations and ultimately from PCs. And what was your equation of when you were building a system? What architecture did you use that system? And NCD took off faster than Bridge had. Our first 2 years of growth were actually faster than the Bridge years. But then, and we took the company public in '92, but it hit a wall earlier that didn't have to do with us and didn't have to do with competition, but had to do with the Unix Windows dynamic. And part of the problem is the Unix vendors were fragmenting. This was before Linux. And there wasn't application portability across their machines, while the Windows market was coming in and the cost of PCs was dropping. So we got caught up in the Unix Windows dynamic because we would sell into Unix environments because of that's where X Windows came from. Just as an aside, when we talk about types of companies, let me back up, because this team approached us. They had a prototype of a product, and they couldn't get funded because they didn't have experience or a management team. And they pitched us on becoming their management team. Bill as CEO, me as executive VP. We thought they were brilliant. We loved the idea, and we joined them. We barely, I think we took a week off, but took no time off out of this and raised money. So,
But this was not part of, did you know you would do this when you left 3Com, or they're really totally independent decisions?
completely independent. We didn't even know these people existed.
okay. All
What
right.
happened is my ex-roommate read that we left 3Com. He knew Ed, and knew Ed was struggling to try to figure out a management team, and said, why don't you call them? On a fluke, we met with them, got excited about it, and decided to do it. And so officially, were all considered founders because we raised the money, but they were the original founding team and had a prototype before we came in.
Describe the prototype. They must have shown you that early on.
Yeah, I just remember being incredibly impressed. Martin is phenomenal, and a character, but a phenomenal character, and just really the combination of how they had thought through the aesthetics that Martin had brought from the terminal business and the trade-offs of cost and performance, and Ed and Doug's experience from Ridge and the system business. It was just a really nice blend. They didn't have management expertise. And I will say, NCD was more Bill's thing than my thing, meaning because it was all about hardware. It was all about cost and hardware and displays. It had enough of a system element that I was excited about and loved it, but whereas Bridge, when I think about those two companies, strategically, Bridge was more my background and thinking. NCD was more about the competitive factors, were about the manufacturing expertise and the bringing down the cost and those aspects of it, and it was a great product. And we, for a couple of years, had again built a sales force. Many of our salespeople from Bridge, who we knew, brought in. It was an interesting combination of cultures because the NCD guys, who then brought in Martin knew a bunch of people from Wise. They had been talking to Joe Booker, who ended up being their CEO, but he became our head of manufacturing. And he had his own set of people, I'm drawing a blank now on where Booker had been in manufacturing. And so we, from the beginning, as opposed to Bridge, which was a culture we created from the ground up, NCD was this interconnection of three past company cultures that came together. Now, it came together not without its discussions and things, but because we were cohesive at the top, it came together and it worked really well. As the Unix market began to shift, one of the things we did was acquire a company a product called PCXware, which put X Windows on the PC. So again, here the whole Unix PC thing is still going on. And so we played in that business. And part of what our strategy was, when we realized that the hardware business alone was not going to provide the growth that we needed, we provided software on the PC and PCXware. And then we did an acquisition of a small company called Zcode that was in the email, the application business, starting to think about applications that ran over X Windows. That second acquisition was an attempt to broaden out into software, was the example of one of those acquisitions that, even though it was small, ended up not working as well as we had hoped in terms of synergy of product and strategy. And so I just mention these as examples of, again, of how acquisitions, some of them can make so much sense, some of them don't make that much sense, but you do them anyway, depending on time, both of them relatively small acquisitions. Now, backing up a little bit, at NCD in 1992, we took the company public. And I'm going to back up one more step, which is, so founded in 88, incredible couple of years. In 1990, probably the most important thing in my whole story happened, which is my son was born. our son was born. I say that for multiple reasons. One, I'll tell you a funny story, which is our PR person who had worked for us in all these companies I've showed this to David, wrote a press release as a gift to us, as a joke, which announced that Estrin and Carrico had come out with yet another product, and it was this size and this thing, and it's all about describing David's birth. So he was born in 90, and in 92 we take the company public. And again, our first couple of years, I think our first year of sales was $13.5 million, and doing very well very quickly. But it was right, in that case, we probably went out too quickly because the market was shifting around PCs. And if we had been private when that shift happened, we would have been able to react differently. But we were public, and we had the length of time we had to react, our profitability, where we could invest, changed the dynamics of how we could respond. Just a cute story of our IPO roadshow when, again, I told you about the intensity of it. But here, Bill and I needed to be traveling all over the place. And we didn't like the both of us to be out of the country on a plane without David. So when the Morgan Stanley person called about making arrangements for our European trip, when we did the US one, we would just fly and come back. And when we did the European one, she said, okay, so you and Bill, and she was funny about it. It was like, I assume one room, whatever. I mean, by then we were married, so it was obvious. And I was like, well, actually, we need 4 seats. We need this. It's like, I'm not coming out with my son and the nanny. And the only way we could do that is she would stay up with him all night because we weren't there long enough to adjust to the time. And we were on this crazy schedule during the day. And the Morgan Stanley person kept telling me that they'd never done anything like this. By the end of the roadshow, they were all so thrilled because roadshows are just tedious. And then in between, David would just cheer everybody up on the plane because they would all pass him around. And so it ended up brightening up that roadshow. But I like to tell David there's probably not many people who can say they were on their first roadshow at 2 years old. And maybe it has something to do with him being an entrepreneur.
Born,
right.
Almost.
I'm looking down at my notes because they're talking about David distracted me from other things I wanted to say about NCD. One of our most important relationships was with Hitachi. They provided our screens, and we then also did an OEM deal with them. And I ended up having to go meet with Hitachi execs several times and bring in another woman's story. So we went to celebrate the deal, went out for this big dinner with the head of, we were working with the division, and like the boss of the boss came to the dinner, sitting across from me. From our side, it was me, and it was our salesperson who had negotiated a lot of the deal with me. His name was Kevin. And so, nice dinner. They're drinking and drinking and drinking. And the guy we've been negotiating with is sitting next to him. I'm not drinking. And I'm watching him get increasingly more and more drunk and being friendly, talking about kids and that. And the sales guy that we had negotiated with, all of a sudden looks at the two of us, looks at his boss, and looks at me and says, well, let's seal this deal with a kiss. I'm sitting here in, kind of this whole thing of you're trying protocol, and I must say it's one of the more proud reactions I've had in my instincts, because I, without a beat, said, well, Kevin's the one who did the deal. because he had negotiated all. The guy laughed, it broke it, we were past it. But it was one of those things that, again, I like to say, I haven't faced any of this, it's fine. But in thinking back, you think about situations like that. And yeah, I mean, luckily I felt confident enough that I was able to react and make light of it. But talk about difference in culture, and I highlight that again because the Japanese culture, the business culture was so about protocols, and we were the smaller company, they were the bigger company, and so that whole thing about power dynamic was an interesting process. So I can answer more questions about that, or I can segue. Interesting people. Ram Shriram ran our OEM sales at one point, and then ended up at Netscape. So again, I will come back and talk about Martin again when we talk about packet design, but unfortunately, not enough people connect Martin's brilliance with Tesla, as opposed to all of the product stuff he's done, which is rich. So.
Yeah, and I mean, he agreed to do an oral history. We need to do that with him.
Good.
But also Rocketbook and the whole.
Yeah, no. I mean, they've just, he and Marc Tarpening, who was his partner with a lot of this, are just don't get enough recognition for the things that they've contributed. So.
But going back to, so how did you choose the name of the company, the 3 letters?
You know, we didn't. They were already calling themselves Network Computing Devices.
Okay, but it's an acronym then.
It's an acronym, yeah.
And so describing the actual system, so if there's no local storage, it's all from a server.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of server? It didn't matter, just any Unix server
Right.
that could handle X Windows. And you had, a very nice screen and just, I mean, it had a graphics processor.
Right,
obviously.
and part of it is that there was a special ASIC in there that accelerated the graphics.
Okay, and customized for what you expected with X Windows. What sort of price point was this as opposed to, say, a workstation?
I'm going to forget the exact prices, but if a workstation was $10,000, it was $2,000, depending on the configuration, and you could get up there and higher with bigger screens. And we started with a, kind of one size black and white, and then we ended up with larger screens, and then color, and then less expensive. And so the whole product line was around the different variations that you had around X Windows.
And what was the network connectivity, though?
Ethernet.
Okay.
By then, the network, I mean, it's interesting because I was doing a podcast on digital technology today and the internet, and I realized that when people say internet today, they mean something different than when I think internet. I think about the network infrastructure. And I was explaining to them why, and I realized that my career was kind of building up the levels of the internet. So once one became standardized, which was the Ethernet and the internet, NCD was a level above that. Precept was in some ways a level above that. And so because the innovation moves up, and then at times it comes back down. It goes in these cycles. But if I think about Bridge, NCD, Precept, it was, where was the innovation happening? Where could we push into new spaces?
Makes sense. And who were your main customers for this?
So we sold to a variety of enterprise customers. So everything from a lot of universities, workstation, software development, telcos, people using Unix for development. I have one, my favorite customer story from them, because it's also a computer industry, was we had an opportunity to get a big deal from Oracle in their development shop. And our sales guys had been working on it. And the sales guy who covered them asked if I would, they wanted to see a prototype of the product we were about to come out with it. So we had a chance, and he said, we've got an audience with Ellison, so I'd like you to come. So we go to Oracle. We were supposed to present to Ellison and his staff at, 2 p.m. or something. We get there an hour early. We set up in the conference room. We set up the terminal. We had orchestrated it of who was going to talk. Jeff was going to talk. Martin was going to talk. I was going to begin and end. We wait. The assistant kept coming in and saying, sorry, the staff meeting's going over. It's going to be a couple more minutes. Something like 2.5 hours later, she comes in and says, okay, they're ready. You have 10 minutes. And I remember looking at my team and saying, let me talk. He's going to come in. Ellison comes in. He sits on the table, not next to the table. He goes and sits on the table in front of this device and says, tell me about it. And so I just launch in 7 minutes, why, whatever. We got the order. But it was one of those things that you realize it's about the customer and how the customer, the funny part of this is how much we had prepared, because this was a big order. It was Larry Ellison, the whole team. We were going to go through this, divide it up, and it wasn't his whole staff. He comes in and just, and so you adapt to the things that happens. But that was typical of one type of customer. U.S. West, telcos was another big customer. I mean, those were the types of, we sold to Sun. The other thing along the way, so we left in 94. In 93, I think it was, Bill really wanted to partially retire. He wanted to become chairman. And you could also tell that story as he was going to give me a chance to be CEO, which both happened. So I became CEO. To be honest, in some ways, was it a change from we had always both been involved in a lot of things? It was outwardly a change, and he was part-time in the office and part-time not. So that shift was happened in 93. And it was probably a shift for me in that it was clear in 94 when we left, for a couple months before that for the first time I realized I had just reached a point where I couldn't do anymore. And so whether it was the companies without a break, I was managing a situation where I was the CEO, but the chairman was in my office all the time, so that dynamic. So Bill pulled back, but we were married. So it was, and being a first-time mom and juggling everything, and the business was tough, and we did this Z-Code acquisition, which was really difficult with a founder that was difficult. And it was the first time in my life that I found myself saying, okay, I can't do all of this, and I need to back off. And we went to the board and said we needed to find somebody to replace me over time. And we did it over a period of time. We found somebody who even worked as a consultant for a while, and I think everybody thought they felt good about. As part of the transition, he also committed to the board, and I agreed to the board to be a consultant for a period of time, and it ended up being really hard to watch. He did come in. He refused to listen to anything. And he basically made a set of strategy decisions and he ended up being not a good replacement. It was hard on the team. It was hard on everybody, and the company was public. There was then a chance where they should have probably sold, and they didn't, and NCD ended up being one of those things where it started to spiral down. And I realized why we made the decision we did. We hoped that someone would be able to take it into the next phase. I mainly feel like I made a commitment to investors when we took the company public, and I felt bad for the employees, but that had, for me, had a sad ending. In the middle of it, though, or right as we were making the transition to the new CEO, Doug Klein, I think it was, said, I need to show you something. I need to show you something amazing. And it was a browser. And very early, it was Mosaic, and Mike Harrigan, who had been one of the founders, and Doug, they saw this as a way to take NCD to the next step in terms of building browsers. And it could have been a fascinating strategy, but the management at the time and the board couldn't kind of make that transition. So.
But how would you integrate browsers with the product?
So I was consulting at the time, and it was one of those things, not necessarily, who knows whether it had been successful, but they had recognized something very early, and they could have leveraged the software. Remember, we had an XPC software sales. It's possible. I wasn't running the company anymore. So.
But I mean, but the kernel of the idea was what? I mean, obviously, Mosaic
Netscape
was for
didn't
X
exist.
Windows originally.
Right, and Netscape didn't exist.
Sure. So
and so there was a thought of getting into the browser business
Okay.
and building out that part of the business.
By the way, I'm curious, did you realize at that, maybe you weren't as deeply involved, did you realize, though, that the Mosaic was built from the public code libraries at CERN? That you could have done your own browser, basically? You didn't need Mosaic.
To be honest, I'm not remembering now, but it's possible that's what they wanted to do.
Because that's...
Yeah, that probably is what they wanted to do. I think they were, what they were showing me was the concept of it. And that was, and the reason I remember this is not so much for NCD and whether NCD could have, my guess is the strategy they ultimately came up with, maybe the reason the board didn't go with it is maybe it wasn't the right strategy. But it sticks in my mind because that's the first time I saw a browser.
And what was the strategy that they chose that spiraled down?
You know what? I don't remember all of the details of it. I think it was as much not continuing a strategy which had them innovating and figuring out how to adapt to the PC Unix dynamics and where to go and take care of it. So it ended up being one of those things where the market changed and the company did not adapt to the change, and so therefore went down with the change. And they also, sometimes when a market changes, you can downsize to focus on a smaller market. You can broaden out, you can do, there are various actions that companies can do that can come out stronger in the end, even if they go through a period where they're not as strong. I feel like they went through enough turmoil in the management leadership ranks that they just weren't able to navigate through this. And I think we need to take some responsibility for it, in that we were struggling with some of that. We thought we had come up with some strategies that could navigate through. And probably us leaving at a time when the company was, in hindsight, not as strong as I thought it was, and having made a decision with somebody who was not who he said he was. So.
And then one question about the timing of your IPO. I mean, 92 was a small recession. But then also, did you and Bill had put money in yourselves, right? Did you come out ahead, behind in the end?
We had put in a little bit of money. Precept was the first place we put in a significant amount of money. I was about to say, I don't think we made any money out of NCD. It's possible that we made a little bit, but
Not significant. And the timing of the, 92, I remember, was a small downturn. Why? But that wasn't enough to change the IPO timing.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah. I'm not remembering all of the dynamics, other than it was pretty soon after we went public that the price of PCs that started to come, and the Unix vendors were fighting amongst themselves as opposed to recognizing that what they needed to be doing was working together vis-a-vis what was going on with Windows, which is a known story.
Yep.
Not
We know
keeping
how it ends.
Yes, yes. So
So then what was next?
next was, so we left in 94. We were never going to start another company again. We had it. We were exhausted. We actually, Bill wanted to move to Aspen. I didn't want to live in Aspen full time, and David was just thinking about school and all of that. So we ended up taking about 6 weeks off. But we took 6 months off. But during that time, it was really about we should retire, we shouldn't do anything. He was on the board of Nouveau Media at the time, so he was still involved.
Well, that had already started, right?
Right. So he was with, but that was the only involvement he had. This is 94. So I was on the board of FedEx. So I was on the board of FedEx since 89. So we still had some involvement from a board perspective, but we're really, I think, struggling with what did we want to do. And one day it would be, we don't need to do anything. We can do philanthropy and board stuff and consulting, and the next day it would be, we don't know how to retire. We're too young to retire. This doesn't make any sense. And so we were in that, we'd take long walks and talk strategically about things. And so we had come up, one of the things we thought about doing was, if we had some interesting ideas, maybe we could find someone else who was interested in being the entrepreneur, and we could co-fund a company but not have to be working in it. So that was one of the models that we were thinking about. And I was doing a lot of reading about kind of where the networking industry was. The other thing that was happening at the time is my sister, Deborah Estrin, was at USC and was very involved with multicast. She was working with Van Jacobson, Steve Kasner, who was at ISI at the time. So there was a bunch of work being done on multicast technologies and on something called RSVP, ways to augment the IP protocol stack for multimedia applications and get more predictability and jitter. And when you think about voice over IP, which didn't exist then, how do you enhance this infrastructure? And there was a bunch of, I remember reading some of the stuff, and I was exposed to it partly because this was what Deborah was working on, and reading about multicast and RSVP and how all this would fit together, and had this thought about, this is going to be the next important thing in the protocol area. And we ended up calling up John Davidson, who I knew back from the Zilog days who had a TCP company who was selling TCP software, and talking to him about what if he enhanced his stack, thinking about RSVP and multicast, and we would get involved as investors and maybe work part-time. And so as this is happening, this is, again, you have a conversation which makes you think differently about it. Bill and I are letting ourselves get excited about an idea because we don't think we're going to be the ones to do it. So we weren't holding ourselves back. And the other thing that was going on at the time is Cisco had all these white papers about the benefits of multicast. They were going to be the first ones to deploy multicast, and frankly, their white papers made it sound like they were on the road to deploying it. I had never really done any work with Cisco at the time. So we had a couple conversations with John that were very friendly. In the end, John, and I get it, rightly thought, you know what, I run my own company. I don't really want partners. This isn't really what I want to do. And I think it was one day Bill and I were talking, we were frustrated. Bill went into his home office, came out about a half an hour later, and he says to me, I did a spreadsheet, and this is how much money it would cost us to just go do this. Maybe we should just go do this. And Precept was born. So you can tell sometimes there are all these planning. We would think about it, and sometimes opportunistic, then something happens and you decide to go in that direction. So we created Precept, and one of the things so Bridge was lots of hardware, lots of software. NCD was lots of manufacturing, lots of hardware. Precept was software only, and that actually, we liked that because it could be smaller, and we could have a smaller team, and we also made a decision not to replicate the team wholesale. We kind of thought that let's hire some different people and bring in new networks of people. We actually went out looking for people that we didn't already know, even though we did hire some that we did know. And actually, I laugh at this because we kept calling people, who do you know, who do you know? And one of the funny things at the time is we kept hearing this name, Chachi Kwan. We couldn't find Chachi, but everybody said he was great, and we ultimately found Chachi, and Chachi came to work for us. Carl Auerbach was one of the early software people. Steve Kasner was working at ISI. One of the things I said to Deborah is, who should we hire? Who's great? And Steve, I got Steve to come up and talk to us, but Steve at the time, and he and I like to joke about this, had not only not changed jobs, I don't think he hadn't bought a new house. I remember interviewing him with his wife and said, have you bought any new shirts? I mean, he literally, for him to think about changing jobs and moving up here from Southern California was literally painful for him. But he was really intrigued in taking multicast and turning it into something. And I love to tease Steve now that we've turned him into an entrepreneur. But that was the last thing he thought he was going to do. And this is just a way of saying that the team was just this incredibly smart team from these different things, different areas. We basically built a TCP stack with multicast support, and Precept was the first time I ever used a PC on my desktop. I had always been a Mac user, and when we started Precept, Bill had always used PC and Windows because he liked to fiddle. I was a hardcore Mac user, and when we started Precept, he looked at me and said, you have to use a PC. That's the market we're selling into. You can keep your Mac at home. You're going to have a PC on your desktop. The other funny story, so when we started Precept, I was the CEO and Bill was the chairman. And when we started the company, as we were growing, we would buy furniture and David, so this is 95, David's 5, and he thought that Bill's title was chairman because he was the one who assembled the chairs. And so it was fun for us to be back in this mode. It was the first, building the product was just fun, and there was, at one point we were going to have an OEM strategy. We called it Flashware, where we were going to sell middleware, and then we decided we really needed a full stack. So we did a lot of navigating through. And those early days were great, except when it came time to deploy the technology, nobody had multicast in their infrastructure. And we had this unbelievably beautiful product that could ship video. Actually, I should back up. So the strategy, the way we decided to deploy this was in video streaming, because I skipped a thing. So we implemented RSVP and IP multicast, but it was one of those cases, again, weren't enough, the market wasn't developed enough to sell this middleware to other people. So we decided to build the application. It's kind of similar to, there's an echo from the bridge days, we were early, and that the clear application would be in video streaming. Nobody did video over IP, certainly not high-speed video over IP. And so we did the server and PC side of it. And this is where having someone like Kasner was phenomenal. One of the things that technologically is harder than people think is the synchronization of the audio and video. I watch video on my Uverse today, and it drives me crazy that it isn't synced. And I think it's partly because I was, spent so much time on that, and how do you make sure that the video looks perfect, because we were trying to convince people that you could run video over an IP network. And we got beautiful quality that scaled because we used multicast. So you didn't need you could use more bandwidth because you didn't have point-to-point bandwidth to every end node. Now, when it came time to sell it, you look like you have a question.
But I mean, you're still sending out the signal from one server to
server to
points.
multiple things,
right.
But you can multicast it. You
right.
don't have to, it doesn't have to either be broadcast or unicast.
But why is that easier than unicast?
It takes more bandwidth. If you're going to 10 terminals and you have to unicast to each.
The
to bandwidth
each one.
On
yes.
Remember,
no,
here was a case
sense.
where the bandwidth of the network, we weren't at the level of network bandwidth that we're at
I didn't
now.
understand. You're right. You're going.
Yeah, not the service.
You still have to get to the same 10 clients.
Right.
Obviously, if you can multicast, it's more efficient than doing it 10 times.
That's right, and it's easier on the server network interface. So the server doesn't need quite as much capacity, and the network. But when we went to deploy it, we'd go to customer after customer, and they'd like, oh, this is wonderful. Oh, they'd go to IT. My routers don't have multicast turned on. We can't turn on multicast. So Cisco was talking about multicast, but the infrastructure didn't support it. And then often in the DSL modems in the last mile of small offices didn't have multicast. So we made an assumption that the core infrastructure was further along. And one of the things we did is we started something called the IP Multicast Initiative to try to get companies that were interested in multicast to get together to tell people that multicast was a benefit to their infrastructure. But it was hard, and by the time we got to the point where there might be any traction, companies, when you have a new technology, you have a certain period of time before the big guys come in. And you need to build momentum. And Microsoft then came into the business. and we had lost that first couple of years. We were getting a lot of interest and a lot of traction, but not a lot of revenue because we couldn't deploy it. I think we had done $1 million in revenue. One very funny story from that time is we were trying to get Netscape was interested in video, and I went to demo the product to Marc Andreessen, trying to get him interested in OEMing the software. And so we used to demo a video of a fairly large, kind of show a large window with really high quality. And he says to me, "That's beautiful." Now I want it over a 19.2 modem. And I looked at him and I said, there are limits to compression. So if you want to go over a dial-up modem, we can do a small window. We can do more lossy compression. I mean, you only had so much performance in the PC in terms of decompression. Again, you're up against the limits of the bandwidth. I said, but you can't have all of this and that. And so he kept going back and forth. I want this at that. And I finally looked at him and I said, Marc, it doesn't matter how much money you have. You can't have this with this. We over time you will, but we have to. So it was, again, one of those classic Marc strengths, which is, I want it, I'm going to drive towards it, but you don't get it sometimes. But that's an optimism that has obviously served him well. But I can still remember having this conversation with him. Fast forward to when I was interviewing people for my book, and I got into another one of these conversations with him about innovation and China and why we needed to this. And he ultimately said to me, and these are all very friendly, Marc and I have a good relationship, but he looked at me and he said, I just figured out why people like you are concerned about XYZ. I don't remember what we were arguing. He said, you're baby boomers. He left. I walked into my assistant's office and I said, I think he just called me old. It was like, so one of the things you realize in this industry is when you're partnering or trying to sell to other people in this industry, it's interesting at times. The other personalities in the game at that point, because we were trying to multicast, but Real Networks was doing.
Yeah. Rob Glazer, right?
Yes. And then the other person who did something in this area, who nobody knew anything about, was Mark Cuban. Really? And I can remember him because it wasn't because he was interested in networking, but he was interested in sports content. Right. And one of his first deal, what was it, Broadcast.com? Well, I'm drawing a blank. But I can remember Cuban on one of the conference calls we had of the IP Multicast initiative of the standards of all of this. And he was, as he is now, loud and outspoken. And sitting back then, one would never know that, fast forward to where Mark Cuban is now. So it just, a lot of interesting personalities. We got also caught up in the bubble.
But
Go ahead.
But Netscape, I take it, did you do a deal with them or not?
No.
Okay.
I think we co-sold with them. They were growing so fast that they had very little time to actually figure.
And roughly what year do you think that was you went to them?
Yeah, we started in 95. This is probably 96 or 97. Probably.
And because Real Networks was already going by then, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, Real was actually getting more traction because they weren't trying to do high quality multicast video. They wanted to do video and decided to do what they could with the constraints of the technology. We were trying to push the technology, thinking that multicast would be coming, and didn't. And sometimes you're early on a trend. You think Ethernet's going to be standard. It is, and Bridge ended up benefiting from that. There are other people who decided Ethernet it was too early. Ethernet wasn't going to work. Sometimes it takes longer. Sometimes you're completely wrong. And sometimes it's too early.
And and the M-bone was just, that was very crude.
Right.
That had been around for a while by then.
That had been around for a while, but at the time we were doing Precept, it was gaining some momentum in the academic community. So we tested our products over the M-bone. The other really interesting customer interaction we had, not revenue, but customer, was we did, and this, I had nothing to do with Disney at the time, but we met a guy in Imagineering that had been one of the early engineers at Disney, and he loved the quality of our video, and we prototyped a version of the client that could stream video and have different wrappers around it. So if you were streaming Lion King, the screen would look different than if you were streaming ABC News or something different. And we did this, we went to a lot of effort to perfect this, and he loved it. And then his boss would not let us even put out a press release, demonstrate it. They just didn't want anything to do with it. Now, his boss, and I remember having a conversation with him. When I ended up, fast forward, on the board of Disney, he was running the internet group. I remember going to see him after I had just been appointed on the board and having a conversation with him about how he had stopped the press release on that. So, we all go around in this industry.
It's small.
So.
And okay, so you had Steve Kasner, but Danny Cohen, you didn't think about, because they both did the packet voice.
Yeah, and we this was about implementing as opposed to pushing the envelope more, and so I think part of the decision for Steve was he okay about moving to productizing something and more the industry part of it.
And how many there are clearly parallels between the packet voice and streaming video, but what were some of the direct, or maybe that's a question for Steve more, what the direct links are?
I would get into that with Steve. I can think about borrowing technology, but that's probably a better Steve question.
All right, so.
I was going to say, so the other thing that happened was that, so we started in 95. If you think about what's happening in the market at the time, because of Netscape and the consumer market, things are getting hypier and hypier. And we were becoming more and more uncomfortable with what it took to promote yourself, to be out there in terms of that just was never our styles and was not my style as a CEO to try to be a celebrity CEO. And the market was just feeling frothier and frothier. And we did in 97 do an OEM deal with Cisco that ended up, again, they wanted to push multicast. Our application was doing that. And we talked to Cisco at one point about maybe either making an investment or buying the company. The timing wasn't right. We did an OEM deal. I got to know Mike Volpe because of that OEM deal. And then in 98, so early 98, it started because Ed Kozel wanted to leave as CTO. He really wanted to take a break. And I think Chambers told him, you don't get to leave unless you find another CTO. Ed probably said something to Volpe. I had known Ed, but not well. And I get a call, actually, I should back up, because 3 months after we started Precept, I got a call from Ed asking me if we wanted to be acquired and talking about being acquired. And I said to Ed, you've got to be kidding. There's no way I'm going to work for Cisco And if I let you acquire this team, then I have to come up with another idea. So no, I don't want to have, he wanted to know whether he wanted to acquire Precept and start a software group. It was at a time when Cisco knew they needed more software expertise. So that had happened in 95. Fast forward, it's 98. We are, again, we've found this niche but didn't break through, strategically trying to figure out how to align. And I get a call from Ed, and or maybe Volpe, I don't remember, one of them, saying that Ed wants to leave. They'll acquire Precept if I agree to go into Ed's role as CTO. And, my first reaction was, I don't want to be CTO at Cisco. Why do I want to go do that? But I also thought to myself, I really owe something to my investors, to my employees, and they're willing to buy the company. And this could be interesting. So I met with Chambers. And I remember one of the things I can just show you what was on my mind. One of the things I said to Chambers is, I'm not going to travel more than 30% of my time. So, because one of the big company things, and I had, before David, traveled 60, 70% of my time, but once I'd become a mom, it was like, I'll travel, but I'm just not going to be that frenetic. And I knew the Cisco culture was very customer focused. And John's like, of course. I went through this whole presentation with John about what the business was and how it was going to do. In the end, John, I got to give him credit. They were interested in the video, and in the end, some of our video technology ended up in their telepresence, Phil Graham, who runs their telepresence. So it's not like it was a bad acquisition. But he was really interested in having somebody come into Ed's position, and in a fairly short amount of time, I found myself as CTO at Cisco. And I negotiated the deal with Mike Volpe, who was going to work for me. I keep backing up because I keep forgetting. But setting the scene again was Precept had this great product. We had a video server version and a client version. What had happened in the marketplace between Real Networks and then Microsoft came out with the media player. So embedded in Windows was an ability to do compression and decompression of video. Video became embedded in the system. They bought vExtreme as part of that. Diane Green was involved with vExtreme. We now have become friends and laugh about how back then we didn't know each other. We knew of each other, but our careers have had some weird parallels as some of the few women through the industry. So they were acknowledging this as an integrated capability to stream video was an important part of Windows. And our product was better in quality, in syncing, in bandwidth usage, but it didn't matter if it required multicast to do it, and multicast wasn't part of the infrastructure. So we were still very much up against that limit.
They were unicast, or?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Cisco saw this as a way to buy a product that they could use for their salespeople to encourage people to upgrade their bridges and routers. It's a reason to buy more hardware, but they didn't need it to be successful beyond that. And then they saw it as a technology and technologists between Kasner and Chachi, and we by then had a broad group of just really good engineering folks. We had a good tech support team and sales team, so they were able to integrate that into Cisco. Again, Volpe negotiated the deal. I got to give him credit, with me knowing he was then going to work for me. So, and Precept got integrated into Cisco. Jack Bradley ran the Precept group in that integration. I moved to be CTO, and Bill for a while was a consultant and then became head of the one of the divisions at Cisco. We can move on. I think one other thing about, so two other things about that time. One of them is just to keep it for historical reasons. IPTV was the name of our product. IP/TV. We were the first people to use that term. It's now become a generic term, and it wasn't, I don't think Cisco kept the trademark, but IP/TV was our product name. And I don't think anybody had actually used that concept. At least we didn't know of anybody before then. So the historian here is thinking, maybe I've heard it before.
Well, no, but you know Tracy Swetlow?
No.
Because that was more about the people using these technologies, but anyway.
It's
we did
okay.
A bunch of conferences on this.
You can offline tell me, correct me, because but the other thing that was going on at the time, which just an aside thing, was the Microsoft antitrust case. And I remember I had some conversations with Joel Klein, but I said to him I would be happy to give him my input, but it needed to not be out there in terms of the people, because we were building software for PCs, and I was in this notion of, the reason I mention it is when you're in the industry and you're trying to help people figure out how to deal with the industry, but you're beholden to the big guys in the industry. We're in one of those cases again, where we're looking at who's too big, what is bad behavior, but the people who understand those companies, it's hard for them to be getting advice if you're still in the industry and you're in this ecosystem. And so I remember agreeing, I had a phone call, and then I went and had this secret meeting in DC at a hotel with Joel Klein and his team, because I was happy to just give them data. All they needed was data, an understanding of different people's perspective. So it was, I think about that time and what was going on in the industry, and the Microsoft antitrust thing was a big thing there also.
And as somewhat of a connoisseur of mergers and acquisitions, what was, how did it feel to be acquired by Cisco?
In some ways, I think that in a bunch of ways, Cisco really knew how to do it, in terms of putting an effort ahead of time, of making clear, talking to everybody, HR being involved, getting people to understand what their salaries would be, creating a group. There was just they understood how to onboard companies. In other ways, some of the same challenges. You come in as a group and a little company and a big sales force, and how do you get the attention of the sales force? And some of those challenges existed. But one of the reasons why Cisco was able to acquire so many companies was that they really thought through this process of having teams in the company that were assigned to work with and onboard and integrate these other teams. It wasn't always a great experience. There was a lot of frustration that happens. I remember my engineers and my tech support people like, I can't go to another meeting. How do I, it's just all of those things. But it also was very clear cut. Little company in big company. So you're being acquired. And I do remember, I got to tell you, it was an incredible deal for Precept and its shareholders. It was
$84 million?
Yeah. I mean, we at the time had done $1 million in revenue. if you think about it in terms of talent, Cisco wasn't irresponsible. Even take me aside, they got a really talented group. They needed a CTO. They got a CTO. So it wasn't that they overpaid. But given where Precept was, it was a phenomenal opportunity. And I remember one of my engineers, when I told them we were doing this, looked at me and said, "You sold too cheap. I expected to make over $1 million when I came here." That was the beginning of a shift in culture. The fact that an engineer joined thinking they were owed becoming a millionaire, there was a distinct difference between that and either of the two prior companies. So, and when I say that the culture was shifting, the times were shifting, in my book I talk about the Netscape IPO as being a fundamental shift, and it was. And so, yeah, it was an interesting pivotal point in the culture of the Valley and what was happening. And I feel, as I look back at entrances and exits and decisions, I feel really good about the fact that it was absolutely the right decision for, I think it helped move the technology forward, right decision for our shareholders, for our employees, for us, in terms of assets that make a difference. That was the pivotal point because, and I still remember talking to the engineer who said that to me later about, none of us expected Cisco stock to go up the amount it did over the next, period of time.
But then it went, unless you sold, I mean, some of them could have ridden it down too.
Yeah, I actually remember having conversations with people even just during that time about strategies as the market was. I have this conversation with people independent of Cisco, is that you're at a company and it's risen and you decide it's only going to go up. And so you don't sell anything because you believe everything is up. And you really have to be careful because when you're in that bubble, it inevitably doesn't stay there.
So that acquisition was in Cisco stock. Wow.
So and then right up to the bust, it went up
the day
many times.
Yes.
From 98 to
from 98 to 2000. Yeah. The day my announcement was announced that I was leaving Cisco, this is a complete coincidence because it has to do with Microsoft, but it was the peak stock valuation of Cisco and price. It then dropped the next day, but it wasn't my announcement. It was Microsoft. That was Microsoft made an announcement that the market came down.
But I hope you did diversify a bit before that moment.
I'm not going to get into my financial decisions, but trust me, it was all. I'm very fortunate to have been through all of this. So.
Because we've done an oral history with John Chambers talking about the. That was a very precipitous drop.
Well, it was, but what ended up happening, that was a drop because of Microsoft, but that was April 2000. There was they hadn't gotten into the drop of the bubble yet. And so that went up and down, and actually, because we had left, we were able to trade some shares during that time. It wasn't until fourth quarter of 2000 that, and I actually remember, has nothing to do with Cisco. I was completely out of Cisco, but I was on the FedEx board. And FedEx happens to be a forward-looking indicator of what's happening. And I can remember during that time about FedEx starting to talk about, openly not, but that something was happening.
Because orders were dropping.
Right. And I remember having a conversation with somebody in October of that year of should they wait to sell some stocks because their tax benefit would be after the year. And I was like, I don't know anything, but what if the market drops by then? Your tax, just weigh it. And by the time January came about, the market had really dropped. So that drop that Chambers is talking about was 6 months.
Oh no, sorry.
Later
I am
after.
talking about the big one, I think.
Yes,
yes.
He probably didn't even notice The one I'm talking about was only because my announcement coincided with a drop in the stock that had nothing to do with my announcement. I laughed about it at the time. So, but we can talk about Cisco. I'm jumping forward, but the Precept thing was. Anything more about Precept, or you want to?
Well, so you were merged into Cisco.
Mm-hmm.
You say the process was mixed, but basically you saw a lot simpler than some you had been through before.
And because people were dealt professionally with dignity and the size of it, it was, and I later came to understand that because as CTO at Cisco, I not only had the kind of looking forward integration role, but Mike Volpe reported to me. So all of acquisitions and M&A and strategy reported to me, legal reported to me. A year after I got there, I also had centralized software, all of the iOS reporting for me for the second year. So it was a pretty intense portfolio. It was fascinating. So did you want to talk more about Precept? No, I'm just going to.
Oh, no, but I mean, is that Precept at this point, I mean, you're no longer, that becomes just one thread within Cisco.
Yeah, it didn't even report to me. So, maybe initially. So Jack Bradley was put in charge of that, and I was emotionally connected, meaning I would check in with Jack and what. No, actually, they did report into me because one of the areas I had, even before I took over iOS, was a small group of people looking at software applications. One of them was security, video. So there was a portfolio of these groups that were kind of orphan products to the company. But part of the strategy was to figure out how Cisco could get more into the systems and software business. And part of what I was working on was how to think about that part of the business so they weren't just selling the most expensive hardware or the not just selling boxes. They wanted to be even if their revenue balance wasn't that, their sales to be more systems focused. So this is 98, April of 98 is
So
when
just
we
tell
came
the story in order.
So, as I said, I had this kind of diverse portfolio. I was reporting, I was on John's staff. The organization at the time was these business units these business units that they had organized into these sectors. So you had enterprise, you had service provider, and at Cisco, there was no, and then you had the sales force. At the power, first of all, the power was in Chambers' office because Chambers' style is very much hub and spoke of the wheel in terms of the way he manages. But the power for him, besides the sales force, was very much in the lines of business. And actually was enterprise, service provider, and small and medium business. And they got to not anything they wanted, but if you could go into Chambers and say, this will drive revenue, or a customer wants this, those guys got to basically drive the business. And in Chambers' credit, the scaling was a lot, really empowered the heads of the lines of business as long as it was driving revenue. Now, I was in the position, what does a chief technology officer, most people don't know what a CTO does, but in one way to think of a CTO, forget about, in a minute I'll talk about M&A and legal, that's not typical to be in the office of a CTO, but one way to think about an office of a CTO is to look forward and look across.
Competitors. Yeah.
Compatibility, interoperability. If theoretically you have customers that are buying multiple products. You would like them to be interoperable. If you're trying to be more of a system business, then you would like to think about how all this fits together for synergy reasons, for cost reasons. One of the things I did was I tried to organize these meetings where I would get people from the different business units together to talk about how they might leverage each other more. I don't remember the number, but there was something like 23 different versions of a type of connector on the backs of the boxes, partly because it was time to market. They acquired a lot of companies. And so one of the things that I tried to do was have meetings where it wasn't just about hardware, but software, but talk about interoperability and what we might do and how we weave this together. I had a couple of those meetings, and Chambers, in one of my one-on-ones with him, said, I need you to stop those meetings. And I said, okay, why? And he said, because people are leaving them uncomfortable. And I want them to do their job. Well, people were leaving it uncomfortable because nobody likes to talk about those. So that was one of the things, that if one of those business units told John that what I was trying to do, or what my people were trying to do, was putting in an ounce of friction into their time to market or making them uncomfortable, or they didn't like it, the answer was stop doing it. Now, I take a little bit of pride in the fact that a year later, after the downturn, I happened to be talking to someone from Cisco. He said, we were in the meeting the other day, and someone actually said, remember the stuff that Judy was trying to get us to think about? They were trying to figure out how to reconcile something, how to consolidate. But it's a question of priorities. And at the time, John's priority was time to market. How quickly can you take, and the market was just exploding, and he wanted everybody to just be there to take maximum advantage of it. A year later, the market was not exploding. There's competition. Suddenly, some of these things come into play. So it is being the person in an organization, in any organization, if you're the one who is looking forward and looking across, it's challenging. But if you're doing it in an organization where the culture is very transactional and very much about success in today, that makes it very challenging. And if on top of it, you're one of the execs who has come in from the outside. None of those execs had come in they had been acquired when they were small. They had been there for a long time. They didn't think you had credibility if you didn't build that credibility at Cisco. So there was this constant, I'll give everybody the benefit of the doubt and not say that it was additionally annoying that I was a woman, but the politics at the top were just fascinating and frustrating if you were trying to get someone done. Now, the person who got me through the time, and certainly the first year, is Mike Volpe. I used to tell him he was my guide dog. I mean, I had never been in an environment that was so political and so trying to figure out how to get people to do different things. I built my career in houses that I had built, not in other people's. I'd been in boardrooms, but that's very different. I didn't ever have to deal with the politics of a large organization. So it was alternately fascinating to me, because when I can stand back and love people and organizations and looking at all this, and frustrating, and then I'd make a little bit of progress and think, okay, how can I make this happen? And I talked, so there was lots of really exciting things. About a year in, one of the people who worked for me, his name is Michel Langlois, was interfacing with the iOS group. And iOS, that organization, was one of the big issues for the company because it was a centralized organization with business units they never were going fast enough for the business units. And so there was a question of what do we do with this organization? There were some management changes. And
okay, so that's just, one thing well, if you wanted to finish the thought from before, but also, you talked about the politics at the top, but I mean, kind of who were the main personalities or the main...
So at the time, in the beginning, Mario was running the enterprise. Don Listwin and Kevin Kennedy were the personalities in the service provider business. And when I first went, it was Howard Charney who was running small and medium business, but then Bill took that job a year in. So in different ways, Mario, Don, and then Don and Kevin were such strong forces in the product definition and in the strategy that there was an interesting play, and they have very different personalities. And Mario is less political, but very committed to his vision and loyal to his people, and what if his people want something. Frankly, Don and Kevin, extremely political and driven, and at the time, Cisco was making this transition of the importance of the service provider business. So their voices were very loud, even though, because they were the future business that needed to be tackled. So there was just an interesting dynamic between all of those things that played out in the staff meetings, but also played out amongst our people. So I'd have somebody working with me who was trying to do something with the business unit and couldn't. So it was a new and challenging job over those couple of years. And again, took on different, initially was beyond just that scope of the CTO, because I had legal and M&A also. Volpe, just a tremendous leader and did a great job in pushing the acquisitions. He tended to go straight to Chambers on a lot of that, and I didn't get in the way because I knew that relationship was there. He would tell me about it. That was one of those cases of you come into an organization and you figure out where to pick your battles. One interesting story during that time is right after I came, Cisco had just done an acquisition of an Israeli company. It was kind of a random in that it wasn't a strategy about what was going on in Israel, and innovation in Israel wasn't quite as much a thing as it became later. And I got invited to something that summer, but was exposed to, it was just clear that Israel was emerging, not just, it always had been a very strong innovator in technology, but emerging as an entrepreneurial center in technology. And I said something to Chambers once, and Chambers was very focused on China at the time. And I remember him saying to me, if you're interested in Israel, you go deal with it. It didn't quite say it that way, but it was, I'm focused here. If he wasn't that interested in that market. And this is, again, one of those cases of you figure out how to work within the system you're in. I thought to myself, if I go tell the business units that Israel is an interesting place to look for acquisitions, they're not going to listen to me. But Volpe, they would listen to. Now, Volpe didn't know anything about Israel. So I said to Volpe, I said, you need to go to Israel. I'm telling you, you will love it. You will go there. And he just loved, and still does, he's an investor, entrepreneurs, and getting interested in people's passion. He went for a trip and visited. He came back just so excited about what was going on there and was able to drive a bunch of acquisitions for Cisco in that market. And so it just is, I tell that story both as in these large political environments, you have to decide where to push through someone else, where to give up, but it was that constant trying to figure out what I could get done, what I could learn. But it was brand new to me. I, again, had never worked in a company that size. I remember going to my first FedEx board meeting after we got acquired, and it was interesting, realize I'd gone from being CEO to CTO. But half of the board members who saw me were like, congratulations, like you finally have a real job, because they didn't like small, I mean, they didn't take small companies seriously. I was finally at a big company as an executive. And another half of the people who saw me said, why'd you do that? You know, do you mind not being CEO? So it's interesting people's perceptions of kind of, in those days, entrepreneur was not what it is today. Today, entrepreneurs are glorified. But even back then, it was before people took that entrepreneurship quite as seriously. One other just thing I remember I was on the board of Disney. I had been, actually what happened is earlier that year, it happened about the same time, I got a call from Senator Mitchell, who was on the board of FedEx. And I still remember I was on the treadmill. And he said to me, would you be willing to go have dinner with Michael Eisner? And I'm like, yeah, what, you know. It turns out that Eisner was, Disney had there was just a Business Week article that they had the worst board in America because Eisner was too connected with his board members. And so he said to his board, I need someone I don't know. I don't like the people, the headhunters. You know, we need diversity. So Mitchell, who knew me from the FedEx board, suggested to him, because the internet was starting to be important, I go have dinner with Eisner. He later told me that for some reason he decided I was Asian. And I don't know if it was a black and white photo. It doesn't make sense, but he said when this nice Jewish girl walked in and had dinner with him, he realized he had not. He was thinking diversity, but it was a different kind of diversity. So I had just gone on the Disney board when I then became CTO at Cisco. And I got a call, this is an aside, from Steve Case to try to asking me if I would be interested in being on the board of AOL, saying there wasn't a conflict with Disney. I didn't do it because I didn't do it and I had too much going on and I had just been on this board. But by the end of the year, they had merged with Time Warner. So it's just interesting timing in terms of the industry. The reason I went down this tangent is one of the big issues going on in the industry was content and content rights. And Cisco was on one side of this in terms of content should be free because content's there to sell our equipment. And here is, if I had never been on the board of Disney, I wouldn't have the understanding I did of the role of content and what it costs to, I mean, it just gave me a much in-depth role. So in that time at Cisco, I often was trying to broker conversations between the tech industry and the content industry, not in some big way, but in these of trying to get people who were thinking about content management systems to understand both sides, that it wasn't a all or nothing issue. And one of the things I did was connect Chambers and Eisner on a phone call. They had a phone call, and this is just a funny story. Eisner calls me afterwards, and for anybody who doesn't know, he has a New York accent and a very strong, people have heard about Eisner, obviously, and his personality. And on the other hand, a very funny guy, a lovely guy, And he calls me after it. I said, how did the call with Chambers go? And he said, good. He said, if I had that accent, everybody would think I was a good guy. He was jealous that Chambers just had this accent that made everybody think, put everybody at ease, as opposed to Michael knows that his demeanor. But I will tell you that both of them know exactly what they're doing in any negotiation. So it was just a metaphor for also at the time of fascinating to be able to see both sides of that as it was developing. So.
And what did that lead to with?
I think that I think it led to discussion. It led to people understanding. Dan, why am I drawing a blank on his last name, who ran legal at Cisco, reported to me. I think he had many conversations with Peter Murphy, who was the strategy guy at Disney. So they might have anyway connected, but I like to think that I was helpful because I very often in these discussions, and it's more so today than it even was then, is we have these discussions, each coming from the own agenda at talking at each other. And it was really a time when the two industries, which only became more and more intertwined and interdependent, needed to understand somewhere in between. And I would say the industry today gets that more. I mean, not always. And we have this whole thing that has happened. I mean, Facebook and journalism is a great example of not understanding and destroying an industry at our demise. But I should say disrupting. But I think it was useful in terms of people's understanding.
By the way, with boards, you were on the Sun Microsystems board earlier on. I don't think you've talked. Is there anything particular to say?
Yeah, so I went on the FedEx board in '89. I went on the second board I went on was the Rockwell board, and I was on the Rockwell board. I went off the Rockwell board when I went on the Disney board. It was too much, and Rockwell had gotten out of some of the businesses that I was more isn't. I went on the Sun board in '95, right, as they were announcing Java, that I then went off of in 2003. So I was on the Sun board during that time, the Disney board, and the FedEx board. In terms of public boards, I did some private boards separately, but
no amazing things to say about that.
No, Sun and likewise, there was a lot of, not only were the board seats interesting, but there was a lot of synergy for me being on the boards and my companies, because I was able to get a sense of the people using the products as I was thinking about the products. And I think too often we build products and we going into markets we think we know our customer or our user, but we don't really know their perspective. We don't understand enough about what is driving those decisions. And I just found that immensely valuable. And being on the boards, it was valuable understanding the technological trends. And
in terms of Sun and Java, were you thinking at all of, that's when you were still doing Precept, right?
yes.
Was there any synergies there with?
We didn't talk some, but there was a lot of there was more. We talked to them about video. There were discussions with their video streaming. There wasn't any real partnership. And once I went on the board, I had to be more careful about what those conversations were. So I would say in Sun's case, me going on the board stopped conversations that could have happened as opposed to helping them, because the minute I went on that board, I needed to kind of disengaged from the conversation. I was trying to think when I was at Cisco what those, I mean, there was obviously a lot of conversation as two substantial companies, but.
And what would you say were the major issues that you were grappling with, you in particular, when you were on the Sun board?
When I was on the Sun board, there was a number of different things with the transitions going on between Solaris and then Unix, Spark versus not, all of that, proprietary versus open, cost points, all of that was going on in those years. And it was just a really interesting time to be involved in that. Also, a very different leadership styles. Scott, unlike perhaps Microsoft that had a vision that it drove down, Scott was this interesting conversation, and Cisco, John very strong but very bottom-up decision-making about the hardware. Sun was this interesting combination of Scott having a very strong vision and these certain beliefs that were going to drive things, but then a very bottom-up or not. Like sometimes I'd have a conversation with Scott about, well, why this? And he says, well, I can't make that happen because the culture was not a top-down. It was this interesting combination, which worked really well in some cases, created an environment of just such smart people that felt empowered to work there and drive forward. But in other cases then became an Achilles heels. And I think that I had some great discussions with Scott about open versus closed, and I really respected him, and I think he respected I felt very comfortable going at one point, I can remember going to him and saying, I collected my thoughts and I want to give them to you in a cohesive fashion because I think XYZ, I'm not going to tell you what XYZ was. And he would listen. And then if he disagreed and was respectful about that disagreement. So I enjoyed that on board. I enjoyed working with Scott and the other board members. He frustrated the hell out of me occasionally strategically. I think the one thing it did teach me that was being on the board of a company in your industry is more frustrating than being on the board of a company not in your industry with a strong CEO. Because if it's not in my industry, it's like, okay, well, they understand this better. But if it's in your industry and you think you see something or know something, and you're having this conversation, it's harder. And that I learned that from Sun. After that, when tech companies would say, do you want to be on the board? It was like, nope. I like the board experience for exposure to other industries as opposed to, but it was a great board. Ken Oshman was on that board. Just a board of. I became Naomi Seligman, who then became a dear friend who just understands IT customers like nobody I know. At the time, she ran, I'm not remembering names this time, what the Gardner Group bought, groups of CIOs. It'll come back to me. But she ran the research group, the research board that brought together CIOs, and she has a Rolodex of that market and just was really tuned into their needs. So it was a great board. Very different from Disney and FedEx. Each one had its own personality, and the opportunity to serve on those boards is a phenomenal part of, for me, a phenomenal part of my career and learning experience, and I love doing it. I'm not doing any more boards, but I loved it at the time. So.
And FedEx was your longest board association.
Yeah, when I went on the board of FedEx, I was 89. I was 20 years younger than anybody else in that boardroom. I was the only woman. I was the only one from California. Phil Greer spent some time in California. So when Jim Barksdale, we were at lunch and said to me that Fred Smith wanted to bring some, I got to give him credit, not just to hire a woman, but wanted to bring some difference in experience, was interested in technology, and Barksdale suggested, Barksdale was on our board, suggested I talk to Fred, and actually Phil Greer, who was our lead investor, Weisbeck and Greer, Phil Greer and Bob Laurie. Phil Greer was one of the initial investors at FedEx, so he was on the FedEx board. That's how we ended up with Jim Barksdale on our board.
I see.
And so I flew out to talk to Fred, and I was really, again, I was very young. It was really an honor to go on the board. It was very intimidating. It was my first exposure with what people talk about as an old boys network. You know, it was filled with people who just came from a different world. I mean, we joke that I was the only one from California, but very different culture from Memphis, from New York City, from the type of businesses that people had been from. And I think for the first couple of board meetings, I probably didn't say a word, just taking it all in. But I started to build relationships with the CIO and really developed a relationship with the IT group. So every time I would go, I would spend time with them, and which made me more comfortable in the boardroom then. And a couple of years after, I don't remember the date, Fred called me and he said he and Dennis Jones, the CIO at the time, had come up with the idea of creating an IT oversight committee. Their boards didn't have it in that time, but he felt that FedEx's business was about airplanes, people, and technology. And he thought it was a mistake that the board didn't spend more time understanding technology, but the board, it was hard to do it. It's like an audit committee. The whole board can't do finance in that depth. So Dennis Jones and I worked together to put together a charter with Fred for what the IT Oversight Committee was like, and created that. And it was a full-fledged board committee, and I chaired that committee. And that became, over time, made me more comfortable in this world, and then obviously was got over that first intimidation. But it was an amazing experience in terms of the level of innovation, the types of issues that a company at that scale operationally deals with. Dennis Jones was an incredible CIO, as Rob Carter, one of the most innovative CIOs I've ever met. And so just a great experience. But after I think it was in 2010, I decided that just things going on, that it was time to go off the board, and I went off. Just again, a funny history story there is FedEx was an early adopter of technology, and I remember going to visit once, and Dennis Jones was all excited that they were going to have real email and not just their IBM email. And he had a business card printed with his email address, but he had printed it in all uppercase. And I remember saying to him something like, if you really want to be in, look at how everybody uses lower cases. So it was one of those things of, just the cultural differences. But they were an early adopter of technology. And then when I can remember another meeting when they shifted from, they were trying to embrace Unix and trying to do more open software. And at the time, HP had convinced them that their transition to Unix and to openness would be through HP's Unix. And I remember having a meeting with them that said, don't get fooled. If you really want a portable application, you better develop it and test it on 2 machines. Don't get locked into people will tell you it's open. But if you haven't actually developed it for both, you're going to get locked into their proprietary features. And these were the things that, again, this was the stuff that companies like that were grappling with. And you came to understand that something that I just knew through breathing it, if you're have a new technology, there's no way to know that stuff.
Right. It's just one more question about the board stuff, if I could. It's that during this period of time when you're serving on the boards of both FedEx and Disney, is part of this period where there's this technological change in which a lot of these, major firms in all kinds of different areas begin to use Indian companies to do software development, this kind of outsourcing movement or global delivery model, whichever you'd like to use. Did that come into the discussion at all?
So it's interesting, less in the boards than like at Cisco. That was a big part of the discussion. But both at FedEx, there was conversations. Both FedEx and Disney are global companies by definition of their markets. So they have businesses spread all over the place and have the issue of hiring in different locales. It isn't so much as a company like Cisco, for instance, which is US based and then is outsourcing a development group. So that was slightly different. But I can remember conversations at FedEx about call centers. So it was less about development, about where call centers would be located, and times when they realized that call centers in certain places in the US could be as effective and inexpensive as outsourcing. So these companies make different decisions at different times. I remember in the Valley there was a time when every venture investor that they were on the board of would ask their startups, why aren't you developing in India? Without a sensitivity of there are certain times when, even if that engineer is less expensive, product development, you have to be very careful about kind of the product managers and the developers and that how that process works and the customer. And so there have been times in the Valley that's been on the sheet. If a company is going to scale, you need to do this. There have been other times it feels like it goes in the other direction. But the IT in India per se didn't reach the board level and was not as much a thing at FedEx.
Was that but was that in your wheelhouse during your time at Cisco?
No.
That would have been.
It was conversation. I wasn't involved with it. So
Yeah.
there certainly were developments going on, and I would hear in the operations reviews from the business units, but I was not directly involved in that. Do you guys want to talk about packet design?
Yeah, but I thought maybe we could talk. You could tell us about a memorable visit to the Computer History Museum that you had around the time, or maybe before you joined Cisco.
So I think about this actually when I come into the History Museum all the time because we talked about my parents being pioneers in the industry. And when Len first came up with the idea, Len Schustic, of the Computer History Museum, and I don't know how early this was, but it was very early. He had pulled together the initial pieces of equipment and had it in a hangar in Moffett Field. And he had communicated with me that this was happening as he was raising money. I remember having a conversation with him, and we had talked about a tour, and I just hadn't gotten around to doing it. And my parents were coming to visit, and so I reached out to Len about touring it with my parents. And I can remember, I'm going to tear up, but I can remember walking through the exhibit, and David, my son, was with me. And it was just, for me, fascinating as we walked through my parents' careers from the history of the computer and the big machines. And then we got to the workstations. When you were asking Apollo, we got to the Apollo, and we entered my career. And then we joked at the end of, I think there was a PC that David used. So it just that arc of 3 generations and walking through, and how having David listen to my parents talk about some of those early computers, he probably got bored pretty quickly. But it was just, it was one of those cases where I have a soft spot for the museum for a lot of reasons, but that memory is there. So.
Thank you. Well, maybe we could talk about packet design
Yes.
for a little while.
I knew I would get emotional. I didn't know that I would tear up. But so back to Cisco, I had agreed with John when we did the transaction that I would stay for a minimal of 2 years. And then we would see how things go. I didn't say it was only 2 years. And halfway through, as I mentioned, I took over iOS, which was 4,000 people. So it was a lot. And I was still doing my CTO job. Bill had gone to run SMB. And after about a year of that, he wanted to leave. And so as we're coming up on my 2 year, I had a decision to make. I mean, I didn't have to that day, but I started to look at what did I want to do? Did I want to stay? And really decided that I wanted to get back to building my own culture, doing my own thing. It was fascinating, but it just was not what I wanted to do. So but I felt very strongly about the organization and about leaving on good terms. And I talked to John, gave John an early heads up. I hadn't made my decision. And we talked about, it was interesting at the time because it was like when I actually did leave, execs were like, "You're leaving? Anybody can leave Cisco?" I mean, Cisco was just riding high, and people took leave of absences. They didn't leave. The executives didn't leave because we were talking about this earlier. The stock price was just doing like this, and if you left, you didn't get to vest on your options. You were leaving a lot of money on the table. When I did leave, I had people like saying, "Are you crazy? What are you doing?" But you make decisions in life in terms of what you have, and I ultimately put together a plan and went to John and said, "Here's, I really have decided I want to leave. Here's the timing. Here's who I think can take these various jobs." And luckily, Volpe was in a position to really take a lot of those responsibilities, and had a great conversation. I mean, John tried to talk me out of it. We went through conversations, take a leave, do this. But ultimately, I think understood what I wanted, and it was a very positive message. about Bill and I starting something new and leaving to get back to an entrepreneurial life. So it was a very positive transition, and was absolutely the right thing for me to do. Cisco was a phenomenal experience. When I got there, it was 18,000 people. When I left, it was 36,000 people. I don't know, 30, 40 acquisitions in the year, more than that in the year before I left. In that time, one of the things that had happened that I didn't go through, but this becomes critical for packet design, is I got an email from Van Jacobson, who had decided to leave and move into industry or move into a different research thing. Another phenomenal mind in networking, who was realizing maybe academic research and there was time to do something else. And because of Deborah, I had never met him, but Deborah said to send me an email, and I didn't have an open rec, but I basically went to John and I said, I have to hire this person. Cisco needs this person. And I will say at that point, John said, if you feel that strongly. And so was able to bring in Van, and then Kathy Nichols, who's his wife, and also just a brilliant researcher in networking. And what Van and Kathy were able to bring kind of from behind the scenes to the business units in terms of helping them understand problems in networking was one of the unspoken people, not real visible, but wonderful experiences of those couple of years. When I decided to leave, at the time, and I guess this is, I was going to talk about this at packet design, but I think this is a Cisco packet design problem. Over the year, 6 months, year before I left, there was a growing debate within Cisco about the rise of MPLS. And if you think about IP as being about clouds, which is you interconnect routers and interconnect clouds, and a packet goes in and it doesn't have a predetermined path it's going to go through. That's why we call it clouds. And you think about telephony systems as strings, which is you set up a predetermined route. MPLS was essentially putting strings on the cloud and changing the inherent architecture that both Van and I believed was so critical to the scaling and what made the internet the internet. But the telephony guys were more comfortable with strings. They knew how to manage point to point, and one of the problems with IP is it always made them nervous. Later in packet design, one of the things we did was develop tools to allow you to have the visibility into clouds to try to make people more comfortable with it. But there was this battle, and some of it was East Coast development versus California, behind what was going to be in the products. And John liked to say that Cisco was technology agnostic. Cisco would do anything. And I, at the time, was like, you can meet multiple needs, but the customers are looking for you to lead. And MPLS ultimately won partly because it wasn't about leading, it was about giving them what made them more comfortable. My view, that's why MPLS won. MPLS advocates would tell you all the reasons why MPLS was the way it needed to go, and it had to do it, and it wouldn't have scaled without it. I'm not going to argue those two things, but we felt very strongly about this as we were talking to the different units, talking to customers, and it was clear where things were going, or indications, and Van was very frustrated. So when we left, it was pretty clear he wasn't going to stay at Cisco because I was his advocate, and the business units were just shorter term oriented, and they didn't care. They were happy to have somebody. I mean, they did care, but at a high level, he was friction. The engineers cared, but he was viewed as friction. So he and Kathy came with us, and we started packet design. And the whole idea behind packet design was not to be a traditional incubator where you incubate, but almost a technology incubator to try to pull into one group the longer term research, what you can get out of applied research, not pure research, and product people, by putting applied research and product development under the same umbrella, that you could get the synergies of the longer term thinking and then try things, and that we could have a number of different projects that at the time were really fundamental in terms of things that were needed to be added to the IP infrastructure for clouds to continue to scale. And we hired actually a couple people who had been Deborah students that joined the group, who really understood. Kasner came with us. And it was just a phenomenal technology group. We were going to invest all the money, then we were convinced by some people to take in extra money with the notion that this is a long-term deal. This is not about short-term. We used to talk about, instead of painting over the cracks, we were looking at the structure of the we did a lot of testing with service providers at what was actually happening in the internet infrastructure that might cause jitter or find problems. So we were really doing some fascinating work. The idea was to then either spin out companies or sell technology to the service providers or the networking companies. So the first thing that happened is the crash in 2000, and suddenly nobody wants to think about these new technologies. And you can't even, if you come up with a new way of doing BGP, one of the protocols, or adding it to it, one of the strategies, if you have a couple of little companies and you get them to do it in order to compete against Cisco, then you put pressure on Cisco to do it. Well, if those little companies aren't there anymore. Yeah. So the whole dynamics of that market changed in a way that impacted our thought about the business model. And then technology incubator types of things, we made some assumptions about how you could spin out companies that we were doing something we hadn't done before. So those ended up being a little bit more difficult. It was a fascinating experiment in getting developers to talk to researchers. I remember having a conversation with, Van put this really well. We were trying to figure out why we had a meeting and people just couldn't understand each other. And Van came up with the metaphor that researchers are like cartographers. They want to map out the landscape. Developers are like mountain climbers. Their excitement is climbing a hill. So they want to find an exciting hill to climb. Cartographers will sometimes climb a little hill to get a better view of the map, but it's not about the climbing. And so we'd have these conversations about what to do or priority, and you'd have the researchers who are trying to pushing their agenda because they are trying to understand the landscape. And the developers are like, could you just give me a mountain to climb? And I want an exciting mountain to climb. And I got to the top of the mountain and you don't even think it's interesting. And so that dynamic was really an interesting part. And there was some great technology around, we had a distributed denial of service security product before people were talking about distributed denial of service attacks. We did some management stuff. We did some testing of jitter on the network. One interesting, along the way, Martin and Marc came to work at Packet Design. First, Marc Tarpening was in the software group, but then Martin joined us initially as a consultant as we were trying to prototype a network interface design that we were doing. And I'm fast forwarding a little bit, but they then were ready to move on. They were thinking about new ideas, and we were fine with them continuing to work there and think about new things. They were kind of part in or part out. And I still remember the day that Martin came and presented to Bill and I that he wanted to build a car. And I can remember sitting through the presentation, and did we want to invest or did we have any feedback? And I will tell you, my point was, actually, Bill and I both agreed on this, which is it was fascinating what he was doing. It was going to be really hard. And interested in electric cars and his approach of doing a high-end car. But that we didn't invest because we just both felt Bill loved cars, but we just didn't really have we didn't understand the market enough. And that we were very supportive of them going off and doing it, and friends, and talked a lot through those days. But one of those investments that maybe we shouldn't have passed off. And they went off and started Tesla. And I can still remember sitting in my office at Packet Design. Martin had said to me, will you take they were raising money. He said he was all excited that they were going to get money from Elon Musk, and would I take a call from Elon? And so I remember talking to Elon about Martin and Marc and how wonderful they were, and he invested. And now the story is that Elon Musk founded Tesla. As you know, he didn't found Tesla, but obviously has played a very important role in its success. But phenomenal. I think the story of Martin and Marc's building of that company is one that's not told enough, because it's just the combination of it's entrepreneurship at its best. It's a boldness, a willing to think out of the box with hard work and perseverance, and all of those things combined. And that even Marc's involvement, that this is about batteries and software. It's not about cars. It is a car, but it's kind of like when Fred Smith said to me, what are we about? We're an airline, people, and technology. And so just all of those things at the time, I just I think it's again one of the stories of entrepreneurships in the Valley that is really really incredible. So
Nouveau Media had ended before that.
Yes, and a part of our connection, Nouveau Media had ended. So Nouveau Media, Marc and Martin and Marc and Doug Klein was at Nouveau Media. So the reason they then came to Packet Design is we had all worked together before. Right. Doug Klein was at Packet Design. Packet Design became a collection of people that were interested in starting new things but didn't want to just start one thing, and we ended up in this transition thing. Doug ended up spinning out one of the companies at Packet Design, which is Vernier, and in the Wi-Fi market before Wi-Fi was as popular as it is today. And so at one point, Packet Design was these various projects that, again, we were going to license or spin out. At one point, we realized that it was a combination of market shifts, things going on in our personal life, that the model of Packet Design being a perpetual startup that would continually do new ideas was not the right model for us. And we took our three main projects, because we didn't want to raise more money. And so we took our three main projects and spun them out as individual companies, and just kept Packet Design Management Company as kind of a holding company, which I then bought Bill out of, and it became J-Labs. So J-Labs is really my lab, Judy's lab. That's where that name comes from. But the way Packet Design was initiated was as an organization that had people, the idea was to have researchers, developers, you'd spin out a company, you'd move people between the company or not, you'd get separate funding from that company, and it would become independent. But we made the mistake of not ever having a royalty stream coming back from those companies. We thought what would happen is Packet Design would have equity in the spin-out. And then an interesting thing happened in the venture industry is people decided the way when you did future round, it used to be seed investors and Series A investors could make money even as the company grew. Something called pay to play came into the venture industry, which is if a company was at all in distress and you raised another round not in a powerful place, even not bad, the venture guys would come in and say, anybody who's not doing their pro rata in this round got converted to common. And that dynamic in the venture industry changed the dynamic for somebody who was a Series A. What we did is we spun out a company, the idea, we did this at Vernier, spun it out, our technology gave us Series A. We didn't have a lot of money to fund these companies going forward. We had incubated them. And when that became a best practice in the venture industry, it changed the way you could make money on being just a Series A investor. And there were a lot of other things involved, but that fundamentally changed what our model could be. So we ended up making the decision to split it into these 3 companies.
And what year roughly would you say that really started to bite, the change to pay to play?
Well, we had spun out Vernier, and we saw that at Vernier. I want to say it was 2003 timeframe. And because it was 2004 that we made the decision that we were going to go ahead and split the 3 companies.
And what were the 3 then?
Vernier, which we had spun out, Packet Design Inc., which was ultimately still exists, got bought by fiber optic company on the East Coast that's public that starts with a C. Ultimately, it spun out and then got acquired. I'm not being good at names today. A good friend of mine is even on the board of it. So I'll think about it and come back. Not a mainstream player in the software networking market as much. And then Precision IO. The technology there was phenomenal. The VAN idea for how to build a network interface in a different way, which would just have tremendous performance advantages, but it involved a chip and different software, and we weren't able to kind of get it to the place where we could prove the concept, and I think it would have been hard to take to market. It would have been a good thing to license to somebody. And the investors, we spun it out, hired a CEO. The investors were impatient, and it was too hard in terms of it would take too much time. And that was a real hard one for me, and we shut it down and laid the people off. And that was not fun. So it's one thing to have to pivot a company, sell a company, leave a company, but to have to tell your employees there is no company, that was really hard.
Could you help me just quickly understand that change that you were talking about with the practices of the venture industry and these very early investors? What exactly would like if you couldn't participate in these additional rounds
They converted your preferred shares to common.
Okay, and that gave you...
And so if a company is very successful, so when a company is acquired or has some liquidity, the whole idea of preferred shares is those shares have preferences. So they get their money back before you'd split it, or they get 2 times their money back, or they get 3 times their money back, depending on what has happened. But if you convert to common and then the company is sold for enough money to make the venture guys a little bit or have them get back their money, but not enough to make any money on what you put in, you don't make any money, and nor do the employees. And what happens a lot is a company gets acquired. The board and the venture guys, maybe they make some money, maybe they make a medium amount. Obviously, if it's wildly successful, it's a different thing. And the employees all have common shares. But the way you make those employees happy is the acquiring company gives them options, so at least you or the people you want to keep. So it's a dynamic that is, I believe there was a couple of changes in the venture industry that that hurt entrepreneurship, and one of them is this. Because it made it harder for seed and Series A investors who were not big firms that could follow on. And often it's those angel investors or Series A investors that are more nurturing, more entrepreneur-friendly, more aligned. And that changed that dynamic. The other thing that happened is a strategy that's just gotten more and more of the scale fast, fail fast. And the belief in what some people call an outlier, which is you're going for home runs. And but as part of that strategy, you have these larger and larger funds, and they have to figure out how to deploy the money. And as part of that strategy is they fail faster than they used to. So you invest all of this money, and if a company doesn't look like it's going to take off and become a unicorn, you sell it earlier. You cut it down. You put pressure on it. There isn't the same patience. Now, from a venture perspective, it's their money. They're allowed to take a strategy that makes them money. I happen to believe that the venture business has suffered. Other than a very few firms, venture returns have suffered because of this, but it has fed into, and it's matched with a time in the industry where the dominant get more dominant, and the technologies and the strategy is very hard. But it has been, people point to the issues today with the tech industry, and we can get into this later, about being about the entrepreneurs and these founders and these entrepreneurs. We should not take the venture behavior out of this equation. It is a ecosystem of founders and entrepreneurs, founders and venture. And the problem is, I know somebody who started a fund, her name's Susan Mason, who has started a fund called Aligned, and part of her pitch is she's aligned with the entrepreneur. She makes decisions not in this scale fest. She's not going to have, she's not looking for the unicorns. But one of the pitches she makes is if you're a venture fund, you're looking for the 1 in 7. You care about the 1 in 7. You don't care about the 6 that you shut down. That's part of the business. That's your. If you're an entrepreneur, your 1 is your only 1. So for somebody to say to you, it's not worth it. It's not worth it to take more time. It's not worth it to pivot past this obstacle. It's not worth it to put in more money. It's worth it to you. It's your only thing, but it's not your money. So it's a hard dynamic between the same way the public markets drive leader incentives with that. So it's all interrelated, and it is. I think the important thing is to understand that it exists.
Yeah.
And then partly you figure out the consequences of it. And for some people, you think about it, should we be changing the incentives such that that behavior shifts over time, depending on where you are politically, as to whether you think we as a society ought to think about those incentives, which I personally do, or whether you believe that what you should do is adapt to those incentives. It goes back to state of nature. The strong will survive. But meritocracy is not equality. And, we shouldn't think that that is fueling innovation in a broad sense.
Well, I know we've come to the end of our time today, but hopefully we can dig into a lot more about this next time. Thank you very much for.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Really wonderful part 2.